There is a war the Anunnaki lost, and the evidence sits in a climate-controlled vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalogued as CBS 10673, waiting for anyone who knows how to read between the lines. The fragment is small, perhaps 20 centimetres at its widest point, clay the colour of dried river mud, covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface 4,000 years ago. The tablet is warm to the touch, slightly heavier than you'd expect for its size, and it tells a story that was never meant to survive in one piece. When archaeologists excavated it from the ruins of Nippur in southern Iraq during the early 20th century, they found it broken, incomplete, the kind of damage that could be accidental. But the content inscribed on what remains suggests something more deliberate. This isn't a creation myth where gods bring order to chaos. It isn't a flood story warning humans to behave. It's a fragment of something larger, a record of conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, divine against divine, with casualties and consequences that ripple through every text that came after. Before we go further, take a moment. Comment below where you're listening from, your city, your country, the time of night or day. There's something appropriate about encountering this material at different hours across the planet, in darkness and light, because the story we're about to explore exists in that same liminal space between what we can prove and what the texts insist we should know. The University of Pennsylvania has been careful with CBS 10673. The fragment rests in archival housing designed to prevent further deterioration, humidity and temperature monitored, access restricted. Museum staff will retrieve it for serious scholars, donning gloves, placing it on foam supports that cradle the irregular edges. The cuneiform is still legible in places, though sections have flaked away or worn smooth from handling in antiquity. What remains tells a story in the Sumerian language about the time before the flood, when cities had names we can still read, Eridu, Bad-Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and when kingship, as the text phrases it, descended from heaven. But the tablet doesn't describe peace, it describes disruption, divine beings in conflict with one another, decisions made in council that split along factional lines, one god warning a human king to build a boat because other gods had voted for annihilation. This is the Eridu Genesis, the oldest version of the flood narrative we possess, and it frames the deluge not as punishment for human wickedness, but as the catastrophic outcome of a war the Anunnaki were losing control over. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki existed as flesh and blood. The question is why the Sumerians recorded their gods this way, engaged in labour disputes, assassination plots, territorial conflicts, and civil wars that required intervention, arbitration, and sometimes violent resolution. If these were merely symbolic stories about natural forces or human psychology, why do they contain such precise tactical and political detail? Why do the texts obsess over who held the Tablet of Destinies, the artifact that conferred supreme authority, and why does that tablet keep getting stolen, fought over, and transferred between different hands through force? Why does the Sumerian king list, inscribed on the Weld Blundell prism now housed at the Ashmolean Museum, record kingship jumping from city to city with the phrase was struck down separating dynasties, as if regime change occurred through violence rather than peaceful succession? The academic consensus treats these as literary metaphors. Enlil represents storm and authority. Enki symbolises wisdom and water. Their conflicts dramatise the tension between force and cunning, order and chaos, tradition and innovation. This interpretation is not wrong. It accounts for much. But it doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain why the Atrahasis epic, preserved on old Babylonian tablets in the British Museum, dedicates hundreds of lines to describing rebellion by a class of gods called the Ejigi, who went on strike after 3,600 years of forced labour surrounded Enlil's house, burned their tools, and threatened violence until the problem was resolved through negotiation and the creation of a workforce, humans, who would take over the labour. This is procedural. It describes specific grievances, specific actions, specific consequences. If this is symbolism, It is symbolism encoded with the structure of historical memory. CBS 10673 is fragmentary, but what it preserves is a pattern. The pattern appears again in the Epic of Ans, where a divine being steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil and must be hunted down by Ninurta in what the text describes as a war. It appears in the Enuma Elish, where Marduk defeats Tiamat and restructures the divine hierarchy by force, absorbing the privileges previously held by Enlil and assigning the defeated gods to new roles. It appears in the Descent of Inanna, where the goddess attempts to seize control of the underworld and is executed by her sister Ereshkigal before being resurrected under negotiated terms. It appears in the Era Epic, where a plague god wages destruction across Mesopotamia during Marduk's absence from his temple. These are not isolated myths. They reference each other. They share characters, locations, and objects of power. They describe a cosmos in which divine authority is contested, transferred, stolen, and defended through methods that look remarkably like warfare. The mainstream scholarly position is that these are theological narratives explaining how cosmic order emerged from primordial chaos. But the texts themselves rarely frame the conflicts as cosmos versus chaos. They frame them as God versus God, with chaos as the byproduct of divine civil war. When the Igigi rebelled, they didn't attack primordial monsters. They attacked Enlil, the head of the pantheon. When Ans stole the Tablet of Destinies, he didn't steal it from chaos. He stole it from Enlil's throne room. When Marduk defeated Tiamat, he wasn't establishing order for the first time. He was overthrowing an existing order represented by the older generation of gods, and the 50 names bestowed upon him at the end of the Enuma Elish were previously associated with Enlil, suggesting that this was a transfer of power, not a creation of it. What if the Sumerians were preserving a historical memory, not inventing a mythology? What if the Anunnaki were a real hierarchy of rulers whose conflicts over resources, territory and authority were recorded by scribes in the only conceptual framework available, theology? What if the war we're not supposed to know about isn't hidden by conspiracy, but scattered across dozens of tablets that modern translation treats as separate stories, when they might be fragments of one coherent history? CBS 10673 weighs less than a kilogram. It sits in a vault with thousands of other fragments, but it points towards something larger. In the chapters ahead, we will follow that trajectory, assembling the scattered evidence of Anunnaki warfare from the texts themselves, examining the Labour rebellion that started it, the weapon that every faction fought to control, the brothers whose rivalry defined centuries of conflict, the flood, deployed as a strategic weapon, the generational coup that restructured heaven, the vertical territorial war between upper and lower realms, the ongoing instability that plagued even the New Order. We will present what mainstream scholars say and what they struggle to explain. We will look at parallel patterns in other mythologies, and we will ask the question the texts themselves seem to demand. If we take them seriously as records rather than inventions, what kind of war would leave evidence like this? The fragment is still there, in Philadelphia, waiting. It has been patient for 4,000 years. It can wait a few hours more while we reconstruct what was broken. When gods went to work, the Igigi rebellion. The first war among the Anunnaki began not with weapons, but with exhaustion. This is what the Atrahasis epic preserves, and it is perhaps the strangest detail in all of Mesopotamian literature. Not that gods fought, but that they worked. The text, written in Akkadian and dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, exists in multiple copies. The most complete version resides in the British Museum, though fragments have been found at various sites across ancient Mesopotamia, suggesting wide circulation. The tablet opens with a situation that already existed before the story begins, as if the scribe assumed his audience would know the context. In the beginning, when An ruled the heavens, Enlil governed the earth, and Enki controlled the subterranean waters, the world required labour to function. Canals had to be dug, rivers had to be dredged, irrigation systems had to be maintained. The earth, in the worldview preserved by this text, was not a self-sustaining garden. It required continuous intervention to remain productive. The Anunnaki assigned this labour to a class of deities called the Igigi. The term appears across multiple texts, sometimes as a synonym for the Anunnaki themselves, but in the Atrahasis tradition, the Igigi are clearly differentiated: younger gods, subordinate in rank, numerous enough to form a workforce, but individually insignificant enough to be expendable. The text states that the Igigi carried the work basket for 3,600 years. They excavated the Tigris. They opened the Euphrates. They dredged the depths. The work was crushing. The language describing it uses terminology that later Mesopotamian legal codes would apply to corv labour, the forced work obligations imposed on subjugated populations by conquering states. The Igigi were in effect a permanent labour class within the divine hierarchy, and the system functioned through coercion rather than consent. At some point, after 3,600 years, according to the text, though whether this is literal or symbolic remains debated, the system collapsed. The Igigi rebelled. The text is explicit about what happened. They held a council among themselves. They agreed to act collectively. They burned their tools. They set fire to their work baskets and their spades. And then they marched to Enlil's house at night, surrounding it while he slept. The verb used is to besiege, the same term applied to military encirclement of cities. The Igigi were not petitioning, they were demonstrating force. When Enlil's doorkeeper, Kaukau, heard the commotion, he woke his lord with the warning that the gods had surrounded the estate. Enlil's first response was to send for the other great gods, Anu, the sky god and his father, and Enki, the water god and his brother. The crisis required a council of the highest authority. The subsequent negotiation is remarkable for its procedural detail. Enlil initially reacts with fury. He considers the rebellion treasonous and demands that the ringleader be identified and executed. Anu, however, urges investigation before judgment. Who, he asks, started the war? The text uses the word war here, tsu in Akkadian, not riot, not protest, but war. Enki suggests a different approach. He argues that the Igigi's complaint is legitimate. The work is too heavy. The burden is too great. Rather than punish the rebels, the solution is to remove the cause of rebellion by creating an alternative workforce. This is where humans enter the Mesopotamian narrative, not as the pinnacle of creation, but as a substitute labour class designed to relieve divine exhaustion. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic is procedural and detailed. Enki proposes the plan. The birth goddess, variously called Belet Ili, Nintu or Mummy, provides the technical expertise. The method involves mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god. The text specifies which god, Wila, described as a god who had rationality, suggesting intelligence or consciousness. This god is executed specifically for the purpose. His blood and flesh are kneaded into clay, and from this mixture 7 males and 7 females are formed. The repetition of 7, a number with ritual significance throughout Mesopotamian culture, suggests formalization, as if the text is preserving the memory of a specific process carried out at a specific time according to a specific method. What happened to the Igigi after humanity's creation? The text does not record them celebrating their liberation. It does not describe gratitude or relief. Instead, the Igigi largely vanish from the narrative. Later references to the Igigi, scattered through other texts, place them in the heavens rather than on earth, as if they were reassigned rather than freed. Some later traditions merge the Igigi and Anunnaki into a single class, erasing the distinction. This could be literary smoothing, or it could reflect a historical process where the rebellious class was absorbed into the ruling hierarchy after the crisis was resolved, their dangerous potential for collective action neutralized through integration. The academic consensus interprets the Ijiji rebellion as an etiological myth explaining human origins and human suffering. Humans were created to work, so gods wouldn't have to, and this explains why labour is hard, why life is difficult, why hierarchy is permanent. This reading is internally consistent and accounts for the text's theological function in Mesopotamian society, but the reading leaves certain details unexplained. Why does the text spend so much effort describing the specific nature of the Ijiji's complaint, not that work exists, but that the burden distribution is unjust? Why does it describe their rebellion using military terminology and procedural detail? Why does Enki, when proposing the solution, emphasize the need to mix divine and earthly elements in the creation of humans, as if biological continuity with the gods mattered for functionality? Some scholars have noted parallels between the Ijiji rebellion and historical labour revolts in Mesopotamian city-states. Workers in Sumerian temples and Akkadian palaces did occasionally strike, refusing to perform assigned labour until grievances were addressed. Royal archives from Ur III and Old Babylonian periods contain administrative texts dealing with labour disputes, ration shortages, and corv evasion. If the Atrahasis epic is pure mythology, it is mythology constructed from the vocabulary and procedural norms of actual institutional labour management. The scribe who composed this text, or the oral tradition from which it derives, understood labour organisation, collective action, and crisis negotiation well enough to depict them with precision. What makes the Ijiji rebellion particularly significant for our investigation is that it establishes a pattern. Before the flood, before Marduk's rise, before the great conflicts that restructure heaven in later texts, there was already division within the Anunnaki hierarchy. There was already a subordinate class with enough numbers and grievance to threaten the existing order. There was already a crisis that required negotiation and structural reorganisation. The rebellion was resolved not through military suppression, Enlil considered it, but the council rejected the option, but through the creation of a substitute class that would absorb the burden. This is not cosmic order emerging from chaos. This is one hierarchy replacing another in response to internal instability. The Ijiji do not wage war with swords or storms. They wage war through refusal, through the coordinated withdrawal of labour that the system depends upon. When they surround Enlil's house at night, they are demonstrating capacity for violence without yet deploying it. The threat is implicit but understood by all parties. Enlil's reaction, calling for his allies, demanding the identification of ringleaders, considering execution, indicates he perceives the situation as insurrection, not merely complaint. The compromise that follows, the creation of humans from the body of a slaughtered god, resolves the immediate crisis, but does not erase what happened. The Ijiji proved that even gods low in the hierarchy could challenge those at the top if they acted collectively and withdrew their cooperation. This sets the stage for everything that follows. If the Ijiji could rebel, what prevents higher-ranking gods from doing the same? If the system can be restructured once to resolve a labour dispute, why can't it be restructured again to resolve a power dispute? The Atrahasis epic ends with the flood, which we will examine in detail later, but the flood comes only after the Ijiji rebellion has already destabilised the original order. Humanity multiplies and becomes noisy, disturbing Enlil's rest, prompting him to send plagues and famines to reduce their numbers. When those fail, he proposes the flood. But Enki, who created humans in the first place, warns one human, Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, to build a boat and survive. The flood is not divine unanimity, it is divine disagreement escalated to genocidal policy, with one faction executing the plan and another faction sabotaging it by preserving a remnant. The Igigi rebellion is rarely discussed in popular treatments of Sumerian mythology. It lacks the drama of dragons or the grandeur of world creation, but within the texts themselves, it represents the original fracture. It demonstrates that the Anunnaki were never unified. It reveals that the hierarchy maintained itself through labour exploitation that eventually provoked resistance. It shows that the great gods responded to internal threats through negotiation and structural compromise when force was either unavailable or too costly. And it introduces the possibility that other conflicts, described in other texts, might follow similar logic, not gods fighting chaos, but gods fighting each other over resources, authority, and the right to determine what happens next. The Atrahasis epic survives because scribes kept copying it. Fragments appear in Assyrian libraries, Babylonian schools, even Hittite archives in Anatolia. This was not obscure knowledge. This was core curriculum, the story students learned when studying cuneiform and theology. If the rebellion of the Igigi was meant to be forgotten, the tradition failed. The memory persisted, copied and recopied across centuries, preserving the detail that before there was order, there was labour, and before there was unity, there was war. The question lingers in the silence between the lines of the tablet. If the younger gods could surround Enlil's house and force a negotiation, what happened when the crisis wasn't about work, but about the weapon that controlled reality itself? The weapon that controls reality. In the myths we've inherited from Mesopotamia, there is an object that appears again and again, stolen and recovered, lost and fought over, with a consistency that suggests more than literary motif. The Tablet of Destinies, called up Emtu in Akkadian, dubbed Namtara in Sumerian, was envisioned as a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform script and impressed with cylinder seals. According to the tradition preserved across multiple compositions, this tablet conferred upon its holder the authority to decree fate, not just for mortals, but for gods themselves. It represented more than symbolic power. It was the mechanism through which divine will become cosmic law. Whoever possessed the tablet could command the assembly of the gods. Whoever lost it became, in that moment, powerless. The earliest references to the Tablet of Destinies appear in Sumerian compositions that predate the Old Babylonian period, but the fullest narratives describing its theft and recovery come from Akkadian texts like the Epic of Ants and the Enuma Elish. Both texts treat the tablet as the central object of conflict, the prize that must be seized or defended through force. In the Ans tradition, the tablet rests originally with Enlil, the king of the gods, who wears it during assemblies as a visible sign of his supremacy. Ans, a divine being often depicted as a lion-headed eagle, serves Enlil in some capacity, guard, servant or attendant, depending on the version. But proximity breeds ambition. Ans observes Enlil removing the tablet before bathing, a moment of vulnerability when divine authority sits unattended. Ans seizes it and flees to the mountains. What happens next is not described as theft followed by recovery. It is described as war. The gods convene in crisis council. Without the Tablet of Destinies, Enlil cannot issue decrees. The cosmic order has stalled. Whoever confronts Ans must face an opponent now wielding the full authority of heaven, able to nullify divine weapons and commands with a word. The text is explicit. Arrows shot at Ans turn to reeds. Spells spoken against him lose their force. Anu, Enlil's father, asks for volunteers to wage war against the thief. Multiple gods refuse. The mission is suicide. Finally, Ninurta, the warrior god and son of Enlil, accepts the task, though even he requires special weapons and strategies to succeed. The texts vary on the details. Some versions involve cutting Ans's wings, others describe Ninurta shooting arrows in such rapid succession that the tablet's defensive powers can't keep pace, but all versions agree that Ninurta ultimately recovers the tablet and returns it to Enlil, restoring the hierarchy. The question mainstream scholarship asks is, what does the Tablet of Destinies symbolize? The standard answer is that it represents legitimate authority, the concept that power requires both force and legitimation, and that kingship, whether divine or human, depends on recognized symbols of sovereignty. This interpretation works well for understanding the political theology embedded in these myths. The Mesopotamian kings who commissioned and copied these texts ruled through claims of divine sanction, and the Tablet of Destinies serves as a narrative model for how authority can be lost through theft or usurpation and must be recovered through heroic action. Reading the myth this way, Ans represents illegitimate rebellion, and Ninurta represents legitimate restoration, reinforcing the principle that rightful authority will prevail even when temporarily lost. But this reading struggles to account for the sheer consistency with which the tablet appears across texts as a contested object, not a static symbol. In the Enuma Elish, the tablet plays a different role but follows similar logic. Tiamat, the primordial goddess, who represents the salt waters, goes to war against the younger gods after her consort Apsu is killed by Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. She creates an army of monsters and elevates Kingu, one of her allies, as her champion. To formalize his authority, she gives him the Tablet of Destinies and fastens it upon his chest. This is not symbolic. The text emphasizes the physical act of giving and fastening, as if the tablet is an object that can be worn, transferred and weaponized. When Marduk defeats Tiamat and kills Kingu, he takes the tablet from Kingu's corpse and delivers it to Anu, his grandfather, as proof of victory and entitlement to rule. Anu accepts the tablet, and the assembly of gods ratifies Marduk's kingship by bestowing upon him 50 names, the same number previously associated with Enlil, signalling a transfer of supreme authority. What is curious here is that the Tablet of Destinies doesn't originate with Tiamat or Kingu. Tiamat gives it to Kingu, but where did she get it? The text doesn't say explicitly, but the implication within the broader mythological context is that the tablet was taken from the younger gods when the conflict began, or that Tiamat possessed her own version, or that multiple tablets existed. If the latter, then the object isn't unique, which undermines the idea that it represents singular, legitimate authority. If the former, then Tiamat's war against the younger gods was motivated in part by the desire to reclaim or contest control over this instrument of power. There is also the matter of the Me, a related but distinct concept in Sumerian theology. The Me were divine powers or attributes, kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, sexual intercourse, music, writing. Over 100 distinct Me are listed in various texts. These were not abstract principles, but concrete powers that could be possessed, transferred, given, or stolen. The goddess Inanna, in one famous narrative, gets the god Enki drunk and steals the Me from him, bringing them back to her city of Uruk. Enki tries to recover them, but fails. The Me, like the Tablet of Destinies, function as transferable instruments of authority. Whoever possesses them wields the corresponding power. This is not metaphorical in the texts. Inanna literally loads the Me onto her boat. Enki literally sends servants to retrieve them. The narrative treats these divine powers as objects, tangible and portable. The Tablet of Destinies seems to function as a master control, a way of organising or wielding the Me collectively. Enlil's possession of the tablet allows him to coordinate the divine assembly and decree the fates that the other gods must then enact. Without it, he is still a god, still powerful in his own right, but he cannot command the system. The loss of the tablet doesn't eliminate his strength, but severs his authority. And authority in Mesopotamian thought was not merely social consensus, it was cosmic mechanism. The gods themselves were bound by fate, Emchu, which had been decreed. The Tablet of Destinies was the tool by which fate was decreed, making it the linchpin of the entire order. If we read these narratives as purely mythological, the Tablet of Destinies is a symbol of legitimacy, and the stories about its theft and recovery are allegories for political instability and restoration. But if we entertain the possibility that these texts preserve a historical memory, the tablet becomes something different, a technology, a device, an artifact that conferred actual operational control over systems the Sumerians could observe but not fully understand. In this reading, Ans's theft of the tablet represents a coup attempt using a weapon or tool that granted command authority. Ninurta's recovery operation was a military campaign to reclaim a strategic asset. Marduk's seizure of the tablet from Kingu was the final stage of a war in which control over that asset was the primary objective. This interpretation is speculative, and mainstream Assyriologists would rightly point out that the texts themselves frame the tablet in theological rather than technological terms. There is no description of the tablet's internal mechanism, there is no manual for its operation. What we have instead are narratives describing its effects. Whoever holds it can decree fate, nullify divine weapons, command the assembly. These effects could be symbolic representations of political power, or they could be phenomenological descriptions of a real object whose function the Sumerians understood experientially but not mechanistically, much like a modern person might describe a smartphone's capabilities without. Understanding the electronics inside, the pattern remains striking. The Tablet of Destinies is never safely possessed for long. It is vulnerable to theft, requiring constant guarding. It can be taken during moments of inattention or vulnerability. Once taken, it must be recovered through force, because negotiation is impossible when one party holds ultimate authority and the other does not. The gods who volunteer to recover it know they face lethal risk, because the tablet grants its holder defensive capabilities that conventional weapons and spells cannot penetrate. These are not the characteristics of a symbol, these are the characteristics of a weapon. And if the Tablet of Destinies was a weapon, or a tool that functioned as one, then every conflict involving it becomes a war over operational control. The Ans myth is not a story about illegitimate rebellion. It is a story about a subordinate seizing the means of command. The Enuma Elish is not a story about cosmic order emerging from chaos. It is a story about a younger generation seizing command from an older generation by taking physical possession of the control mechanism. The fact that Marduk delivers the tablet to Anu rather than keeping it himself is significant. It suggests that possession alone is insufficient. The tablet must be held by someone the assembly recognizes, or its power cannot be exercised. Authority requires both the tool and the legitimacy to wield it. Marduk gains both by defeating Tiamat, claiming the tablet, and securing the assembly's ratification. The texts do not tell us what became of the Tablet of Destinies after Marduk's rise. Later Babylonian theology assumes Marduk holds it permanently as king of the gods, but the silence is suggestive. If the tablet was so central to conflicts before Marduk, why does it disappear from narratives afterward? One possibility is that the theological evolution of Babylonian religion centralized authority in Marduk to such a degree that the idea of the tablet being stolen became theologically impossible to narrate. Another possibility is that whatever the tablet represented in earlier periods ceased to be relevant or accessible by the time later texts were composed, and the memory of its contested status was preserved only in older narratives copied by scribes who no longer fully understood the original. Context. The Tablet of Destinies is the pivot point. It is the object that turns political conflict into existential war, because losing it means losing the ability to shape what happens next. It is the reason Enlil, despite his strength, is paralysed when Ans steals it. It is the reason Tiamat gives it to Kingu before battle. It is the reason Marduk's victory is incomplete until he takes it from Kingu's chest and presents it to the assembly. Whoever you are in the hierarchy, whatever your power, you cannot rule without it. And because you cannot rule without it, everyone who seeks to rule must either hold it, take it, or destroy the one who does. In the next conflict we will examine, the tablet has already been stolen. The war to recover it has already begun, and the god chosen to fight that war will shape the future of heaven through violence. Anzi's theft and Ninurta's war. The Epic of Ans survives in multiple versions spanning more than a millennium, from Old Babylonian fragments dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE to Neo-Assyrian copies from the 1st millennium. The Electronic Babylonian Library preserves and catalogues these versions, allowing scholars to compare how the narrative evolved over time. Despite variations in detail, the core story remains consistent. Ans, a divine being described as a massive bird with a lion's head, steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil and must be hunted down by Ninurta in a war that nearly fails. What makes this narrative particularly significant is the level of tactical and strategic detail it contains. This is not a vague story about good triumphing over evil. It is a military campaign described with attention to weapons, terrain, morale, and the specific problems posed by an enemy wielding ultimate authority. Ans's position before the theft varies slightly across versions, but most place him in a role of proximity to Enlil, guardian, doorkeeper, or attendant with access to the inner sanctum of divine authority. The text describes Ans's growing resentment as he watches the gods bow to Enlil, recognizing that their submission is not to Enlil's person, but to the authority he wields through the Tablet of Destinies. Ans begins to reason within himself, and the text preserves his internal monologue: I will take the Tablet of Destinies for myself. I will control the decrees of all the gods. I will establish my throne and be master of the norms. I will direct all the Igigi. The reference to the Igigi here is fascinating. Ans does not merely want personal power. He wants command over the class of divine workers whose rebellion we examined earlier. This suggests that Ans's ambition is not individual, but systemic. He intends to restructure the hierarchy itself. The moment of theft is described with specific detail. Enlil is bathing, having removed his regalia and laid the tablet aside. Ans watches, waits, and at the opportune moment seizes the tablet and flees to his mountain stronghold. The text emphasizes the immediate consequences. Suspended were the divine norms. Stillness spread, silence reigned. Father Enlil was dumbstruck. The language here is not metaphorical silence, but operational paralysis. The system has stopped functioning. Enlil cannot issue commands. The assembly cannot convene. The cosmic order, dependent on continuous divine administration, has ground to a halt. Anu convenes what remains of the divine leadership and asks for a volunteer to go to war against Ans. The phrasing is explicit, anatsi, to battle. This is not a diplomatic mission. This is a combat operation to kill or capture an enemy combatant who is now wielding the ultimate weapon. The first god approached is Adad, the storm god. He refuses, explaining the tactical problem: who can go up against Ans? He who is master of the Tablet of Destinies can turn back any weapon, can nullify any spell. This is the central military dilemma. Conventional force is useless against an opponent who controls the rules of engagement. Any attack can be negated by decree. Any weapon can be transformed into harmless material. The tablet grants its holder not just authority, but an active defense system that renders normal warfare obsolete. Other gods are approached. All refuse for the same reason. Finally, Ea suggests Ninurta, the warrior god, son of Enlil, and therefore personally invested in restoring his father's authority. Ninurta accepts the mission, but even he requires special weapons. The text describes his mother, Belet Eli, fashioning arrows with specific properties, and the strategy Ea devises involves exploiting a weakness in the tablet's defences. The logic, as preserved in the narrative, is that the tablet can counter a single attack or spell spoken once, but if Ninurta strikes with overwhelming speed and volume, shooting arrows in such rapid succession that there is no time to counter each one, the defences can be saturated. This is not magic, this is tactics. The battle itself takes place in the mountains, where Ans has established his position. The text describes multiple engagements. In the first confrontation, Ninurta shoots an arrow, but Ans decrees, "Arrow that has come, return to your reed thicket, bow, back to your wood, bowstring, back to the ram's gut." The arrow transforms mid-flight and falls harmlessly. Ninurta retreats and reports the failure. E refines the strategy. Ninutar must attack with such intensity that Ans cannot speak fast enough to counter every projectile. This requires not just skill, but endurance, sustained assault until the defense system is overwhelmed. In the climactic battle, Ninurta follows this strategy. He launches a barrage. The text describes Ans attempting to counter, but the sheer volume is too much. An arrow strikes, then another. The text becomes fragmentary at this point, with different versions providing different details. Some say Ninurta severs Ans's wing tendons, others describe a direct kill shot, but the outcome is consistent. Ans falls. Ninurta retrieves the Tablet of Destinies and brings it back to Enlil. Order is restored. The assembly convenes and ratifies Ninurta's victory with honours and titles. He is declared champion of the gods, and temples across Mesopotamia will honour him as the warrior who saved the hierarchy from collapse. Mainstream scholarship interprets the Ans myth as a narrative legitimising Ninurta's cult and explaining his role as divine warrior. The story reinforces the principle that legitimate authority, temporarily lost, will be restored through heroic action. Ans represents chaos or hubris, and his defeat demonstrates that those who overreach will be brought down by the rightful order. This reading accounts for the myth's theological function in Babylonian and Assyrian religion, where Ninurta was widely worshipped and where his temples received royal patronage. Kings identified with Ninurta's role as restorer of order, framing their own military campaigns as analogous to his defeat of cosmic rebellion. But the reading leaves tactical details unexplained. Why does the text spend so much effort describing the specific problem of the tablet's defensive capabilities? Why does it describe multiple gods refusing the mission because they recognise the strategic impossibility? Why does Ea have to devise a counter-strategy based on saturating the defence system rather than simply decreeing victory through divine fiat? If this is purely symbolic narrative, the symbolism is unusually technical. The story reads less like allegory and more like after-action report. Someone attempted a coup, conventional response failed, a specialised operation was devised, and the operation succeeded after multiple attempts. There is also the question of what happened to Ans after defeat. Most versions of the myth end with his death, but a few later references suggest Ans survived and was reassigned to a subordinate role, his wings clipped, his ambition neutralised through permanent surveillance. If Ans was killed, his body disappears from the narrative. There is no burial, no disposal, no aftermath. This could be literary economy, the story ends when order is restored, or it could reflect uncertainty about what became of the defeated party. The Ans myth also introduces a pattern that will repeat in later conflicts, the younger generation fighting to preserve or restore an order established by the older generation. Ninurta is Enlil's son. His loyalty is filial as well as hierarchical, but the fact that he must fight at all indicates that the hierarchy is not stable. It is vulnerable to internal challenge by those with proximity to power, and it requires constant defence through force. Enlil, despite being king of the gods, cannot defend himself when the tablet is taken. He depends on others to wage war on his behalf. This is not absolute sovereignty. This is delegated authority maintained through coalition and kinship networks. What the text does not explain is why Ans thought he could succeed. If the Tablet of Destinies grants ultimate authority, why didn't Ans simply decree Enlil's submission and Ninurta's defeat? The text implies limits. The tablet grants operational control, the ability to nullify attacks, command the Ajiji, direct the assembly, but it does not grant omnipotence. the holder still requires recognition, legitimacy, or at minimum, the absence of effective resistance. Ninurta's overwhelming assault exploited a gap in the tablet's capabilities. It could counter one attack at a time, but not infinite simultaneous attacks. This suggests the tablet functions through a process, not through pure will, and processes can be overwhelmed. Or perhaps the tablet requires training to use effectively. Anne steals it and flees immediately without taking time to master its full capabilities. His use of it in battle is defensive, countering attacks, but he never goes on the offensive, never uses it to strike at Ninurta directly, never decrees Ninurta's death or Enlil's permanent removal. Either Anne's lacked the knowledge to wield the tablet's full power, or the tablet itself has operational limits that the texts preserve but do not explain. The war to recover the Tablet of Destinies establishes a precedent. Authority can be stolen, and when it is stolen, the response must be military. Negotiation is not attempted. Diplomacy is not an option. The only solution is force, and even force requires specialized tactics devised by the wisest gods and executed by the strongest. This is not symbolic order versus chaos. This is one faction within the hierarchy using violence to recover a tool that another faction sees through opportunistic theft. Both sides understand that whoever holds the tablet controls what happens next, and therefore the war is existential. Ans cannot afford to lose because losing means death. Ninurta cannot afford to fail because failure means the collapse of the entire system his father represents. The tablet is recovered, Enlil's authority is restored, but the fact that it happened once means it can happen again. And in the next conflict we examine, the struggle will not be between a subordinate and his master, but between brothers at the highest level of the hierarchy, locked in a rivalry that will shape the fate of both gods and humans. Brothers in opposition, Enki and Enlil. At the centre of the Anunnaki hierarchy, preserved across dozens of texts spanning millennia, sits a persistent rivalry between two gods, Enlil and Enki. Known in Akkadian sources as Elil and Ea respectively, these divine brothers occupy complementary but competing spheres of authority. Enlil is the king of the gods, lord of the wind and storm, the one who holds the Tablet of Destinies and convenes the divine assembly. Enki is the god of wisdom, fresh water, and magic, lord of the Abzu, the subterranean ocean, and the one who solves problems through cunning when force fails. The relationship between them is never openly hostile in the way Ans's rebellion was hostile, but it is defined by consistent disagreement over policy, particularly regarding humanity. In nearly every major crisis preserved in Mesopotamian literature, Enlil and Enki take opposite positions, and the resolution comes not through consensus, but through one brother outmaneuvering the other. The texts do not provide a single origin story explaining why the brothers hold such different domains, or why their approaches to governance diverge so sharply. What we have instead is a pattern of incidents where the same dynamic repeats. Enlil decrees action, often severe. Enki undermines the decree, often through secret intervention. The assembly either accepts the outcome or negotiates a compromise. The cycle continues. This is not the relationship of allies working toward a common goal. This is the relationship of rivals operating within a system that requires both to function but gives neither complete control. The earliest expression of this dynamic appears in the Eridu Genesis, the fragmentary Sumerian flood narrative we encountered at the beginning. The text is badly damaged, but what survives describes the creation of humanity, the establishment of kingship in 5 antediluvian cities, and a crisis. Humanity multiplies and becomes noisy, disturbing Enlil's sleep. The verb used rigmu means noise or clamour, but it carries connotations of disorder, rebellion or chaos. Enlil's response is procedural. He does not act unilaterally, but brings the matter before the divine assembly. He proposes a series of measures to reduce the human population: plague, famine, drought. The assembly agrees. The measures are implemented, but each time the crisis is averted. The text does not specify how, but later traditions identify Enki as the one who secretly instructs humans on how to survive each calamity, which god to appease, which offerings to make, which actions to take. After repeated failures, Enlil proposes a final solution, the flood. This time, he demands secrecy. The gods swear an oath not to warn humanity. The assembly agrees. But Enki finds a way around the oath. He cannot speak directly to a human without violating the agreement, so he speaks to a wall, while a human, Ziusudra or Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, listens from the other side. Enki instructs him to tear down his house, use the materials to build a boat, and take aboard the seed of all living things. Ziusudra obeys. The flood comes. Humanity is wiped out except for those on the boat. When the waters recede, Enlil discovers what happened and flies into a rage. He demands to know which god broke the oath. Enki admits to the act, but justifies it through legal reasoning. He did not speak to a human directly, and preserving some humans ensures the continuation of the labour force the gods depend on. The assembly accepts this logic, and Enlil, though furious, grants Ziusudra and his descendants eternal life as compensation. The Atrahasis epic preserves the same events in greater detail, and the confrontation between Enlil and Enki is more explicit. After the flood, Enlil approaches the boat and sees smoke rising from Ziusudra's sacrifice. He realizes someone survived and accuses Enki directly. How did any man escape? No one was to survive the destruction. Enki's response is remarkable for its rhetorical strategy. He does not deny the accusation. Instead, he shifts blame. I did not reveal the secret of the great gods. I showed Atrahasis a dream, and he understood. This is casuistry, the use of technicalities to evade the spirit of an agreement while honouring its letter. Enlil's oath prohibited direct warning, so Enki used indirect communication. The assembly's prohibition was against revealing the secret, so Enki claims he revealed nothing. Atrahasis simply interpreted a dream correctly. What is significant here is not just that Enki sabotages Enlil's plan, but that he does so repeatedly and successfully. This is not a one-time act of mercy. This is a sustained campaign of resistance to policies Enki considers unjust or counterproductive. Enlil represents the principle of order maintained through force and purgation. When there is a problem, eliminate the source. When humans become noisy, reduce their numbers. When reduction fails, eliminate them entirely. Enki represents the principle of order maintained through management and adaptation. When there is a problem, adjust the system. When humans become numerous, regulate their reproduction. When regulation is insufficient, preserve a remnant and start over with better controls. The question mainstream scholarship asks is what these two gods symbolize within Mesopotamian theology. The standard answer is that Enlil represents sovereign authority, the harsh but necessary force that maintains cosmic order through decisive action, while Enki represents wisdom and craft, the intellectual power that solves problems through cleverness rather than violence. This interpretation works well as a theological binary, and it explains why both gods receive extensive worship despite their opposing approaches. They represent complementary aspects of divinity, neither complete without the other. But this reading does not fully account for the consistency of their opposition or the specific nature of their disagreements. It is always about humanity. It is always Enlil wanting to reduce or destroy the human population, and Enki intervening to preserve it. If these are purely symbolic figures representing abstract principles, why does the conflict manifest in such consistent specific terms? Why doesn't the rivalry play out in other domains? Control of weather, management of the netherworld, administration of justice? The text preserved disagreements almost exclusively about what to do with humans, and the disagreements escalate from policy debate to secret sabotage to open accusation. Some scholars have suggested that the Enlil-Enki rivalry reflects historical tensions between different priestly or political factions within Mesopotamian city-states. Enlil's cult centre was Nippur, a city that held religious significance but limited political power, serving as a neutral site for intercity assemblies. Enki's cult centre was Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Sumer, with traditions claiming it as the first city where kingship descended from heaven. The rivalry between Enlil and Enki in the myths might preserve or reflect rivalry between Nippur's priests and Eridu's priests, each promoting their patron deity as supreme while acknowledging the other's importance. But even if the rivalry has sociological roots, the texts preserve it as personal and consistent. Enlil and Enki are portrayed as brothers with fundamentally opposed philosophies of governance. They do not fight openly, they do not go to war, but they undermine each other's policies, and the result is a cosmos perpetually unstable, lurching from crisis to crisis, because the two most powerful gods cannot agree on what should be done. There is another dimension to the rivalry that appears in later Babylonian texts: succession. Enlil is king of the gods because he inherited the position from his father Anu, who withdrew to the heavens and left Earth's administration to his sons. Enki, though wise and older in some traditions, was passed over for kingship. The texts do not explain why, though later mythographers invented justifications involving birthright and legitimacy. What matters is that Enki possesses the capability to rule. He is clever enough, powerful enough, respected enough, but does not hold the position. Enlil holds the position, but his decisions require Enki's cooperation or can be undermined by Enki's intervention. This is a recipe for persistent dysfunction, and it plays out across the mythological corpus with remarkable consistency. By the time of the Enuma Elish, composed during the Babylonian Empire's ascendancy, the rivalry has been partially resolved through generational replacement. Marduk, son of Enki, rises to supreme authority by defeating Tiamat and restructuring the cosmos. But Marduk's rise does not erase the Enlil-Enki dynamic, it absorbs it. Marduk inherits his father's wisdom and cunning, and he inherits Enlil's authority and force by taking the Tablet of Destinies. He becomes, in effect, the synthesis the older generation could never achieve. But before Marduk's rise, before the generational coup, there are the two brothers locked in perpetual opposition. Enlil convenes the assembly. Enki attends, but does not always comply. Enlil decrees policy. Enki finds loopholes. Enlil relies on force and authority. Enki relies on intelligence and subversion. The system requires both to function, but it cannot reconcile them. And the most catastrophic expression of their rivalry, the deployment of the flood as a strategic weapon, will nearly destroy everything the Anunnaki had built. The flood is not a natural disaster in the Mesopotamian texts. It is a weapon of mass destruction, deliberately deployed by one faction within the divine hierarchy to resolve a crisis that could not be resolved through other means, and it is sabotaged by another faction that considered the weapon disproportionate and counterproductive. The war the Anunnaki lost was not against an external enemy, it was against themselves. The flood as weapon. The flood narratives preserved in Mesopotamian literature are often read as religious explanations for natural disasters, theological meditations on divine judgment, or mythological precursors to biblical tradition. But when examined closely, the Sumerian and Akkadian flood accounts describe something more specific and more disturbing: the deliberate deployment of a catastrophic weapon by one faction of the Anunnaki against another faction's policy objectives, with humanity as collateral damage in a divine conflict that had escalated beyond negotiation. The most detailed version appears in the Atrahasis epic, preserved on multiple Old Babylonian tablets, now housed in the British Museum and other collections. The narrative structure is clear: humanity multiplies, their noise disturbs Enlil, he proposes incremental measures to reduce their population, those measures fail, he proposes the flood as a final solution, The assembly agrees under oath of secrecy. Enki violates the oath by warning Atrahasis. The flood is deployed anyway. Atrahasis survives, and the aftermath requires a new agreement governing human reproduction and mortality. What makes this account significant is the procedural detail. Enlil does not act on impulse. He brings the matter before the divine assembly repeatedly. The first measure is plague, sent through the agency of Namtar, the plague god. Humans suffer and die in large numbers, but Enki instructs the survivors to focus all worship and offerings on Namtar specifically, appeasing him until he relents. The plague ends, humanity recovers, the noise resumes. Enlil convenes the assembly again and proposes drought. The text describes the mechanism. The rain god Adad is instructed to withhold rain from above, and Enki is instructed to withhold water from below, sealing the underground springs. The upper and lower waters, normally managed by different divine authorities, are coordinated in a joint blockade. For 3 years the drought holds, famine spreads, humanity begins to die in massive numbers. But again, Enki provides secret guidance. The text is fragmentary here, but the surviving lines suggest Enki instructs humans to fish the rivers and seas intensively, exploiting the one resource not controlled by the blockade. Humanity survives, though greatly weakened. The drought ends. Population begins to recover. The noise resumes. Enlil's third attempt involves a more comprehensive embargo. All the gods are instructed to withhold their blessings simultaneously. No rain, no spring water, no fertile soil, no successful hunts, no healthy livestock. The text describes Earth becoming barren, a land where nothing grows and nothing lives. This time, humanity comes close to total extinction. Mothers eat their own children. The social order collapses. But Enki cannot allow complete annihilation, because the gods still require the labour force. He finds a way to slip resources to the survivors. Exactly how is unclear from the damaged text, and once again, a remnant endures. At this point, Enlil's patience is exhausted. He convenes the assembly and demands a final solution that cannot be sabotaged: the flood. The proposal is strategic in its totality. Water will come from above and below simultaneously. Adad will release the rains. Enki will release the subterranean ocean. The storm god will drive the winds. The dike god will break the dams. Every divine authority controlling water will act in concert, and the result will be complete inundation, leaving no high ground, no refuge, no possibility of survival. The assembly agrees. To prevent sabotage, Enlil requires an oath from all the gods, including Enki, that none will warn humanity. The oath is sworn, the plan is set. But Enki has already decided to violate the oath. The text is explicit about his reasoning. He addresses the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, speaking to the structure rather than the man inside, preserving the technical letter of the oath while violating its spirit. Reed wall, pay attention. Wall, listen to me. Tear down your house, build a boat. Reject possessions, save life. The boat you build, roof it over like the Apsu. Let her length and breadth be equal. Roof her over like the subterranean waters. The instructions are precise. This is not vague divine inspiration. This is engineering guidance, dimensions, materials, construction technique, waterproofing, loading procedures. Enki provides the blueprint for survival. Atrahasis obeys. He dismantles his house, using the materials to construct the boat according to specifications. He loads aboard his family, skilled craftsmen, livestock, and seed stores. The text specifies that he includes representatives of all domesticated animals and preserves the knowledge of all crafts, as if Enki's intention is not merely to save lives, but to ensure civilization can be rebuilt. When the boat is complete, Atrahasis seals the door. The flood begins. The description of the flood itself is harrowing in its intensity. Adad thunders in the clouds. The Anunnaki hold torches, setting fire to the land even as water rises. The Dyke god tears out the dam posts. The 7 judges of the underworld lift their torches, illuminating the land with fire. The storm levels everything. No one can see anyone else. The gods themselves become frightened by what they have unleashed. The text describes the gods cowering like dogs, crouching against the outer wall of heaven, terrified by the destruction occurring below. Even the birth goddess, Beletili, regrets the decision and weeps. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order battle to destroy my people? It is I who give birth to my people, and now, like fish spawn, they fill the sea. This detail is crucial. The gods did not anticipate the emotional and psychological impact of watching humanity drown en masse. Bele-Ili, who helped create humans from clay and divine blood, experiences the annihilation as personal loss. The gods weep, thirst for beer, and huddle in fear. This is not the behaviour of beings confidently executing divine judgment. This is the behaviour of authorities who have lost control of the weapon they deployed. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it subsides, Atrahasis opens a window and sees corpses floating like fish spawn. He offers sacrifice, burning aromatic woods, whose smoke rises to the heavens. The gods, who have been without offerings since humanity was destroyed, smell the sacrifice and swarm around it like flies, desperate for the sustenance they have been denied. This image is remarkable for its unflattering honesty. The gods are not self-sufficient. They are dependent on human offerings for something essential, and the flood has cut off their supply. Enlil arrives at the scene, sees the boat, and immediately understands what happened. His rage is volcanic. How did any human escape? No one was to survive the destruction. He accuses the gods collectively, but his suspicion falls on Enki, who has sabotaged previous measures. Enki's defence is a masterpiece of rhetorical manoeuvring. He does not deny the act, but reframes it, was it I who did this? It was Enlil who made the decision for the deluge. It is Enlil who chose the annihilation. Why did you impose this? Why destroy your own workforce? Punish the sinner for his sin, punish the transgressor for his transgression, but do not cut off the whole. Instead of your making a flood, let a lion rise up to diminish the people. Instead of your making a flood, let a wolf rise up to diminish the people. Instead of your making a flood, let famine occur to destroy the land. Instead of your making a flood, let error rise up and slaughter the people. Enki's argument is pragmatic rather than moral. He does not claim the flood was unjust. He claims it was inefficient. The goal was population control, and there were better methods, predation, famine, disease, that would reduce numbers without eliminating the labour force entirely. The flood was overkill, a disproportionate response that damaged the god's own interests, and by preserving Atrahasis, Enki ensured the system could continue functioning, albeit with new controls in place. The assembly accepts this logic. A compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but new limits are imposed. Some women will be barren. Some infants will die young. A class of priestesses will be forbidden from bearing children. Human lifespans will be shortened. Mortality will be structured to ensure population remains manageable without divine intervention. Atrahasis and his wife are granted eternal life and relocated to Dilmun, a distant paradise where they will not interfere with the new order. Mainstream scholarship interprets the flood narrative as an etiological myth explaining natural disasters, human mortality, and the origins of infant mortality and barrenness. The story answers theological questions. Why do people die young? Why are some women infertile? Why do floods occur? The answers are embedded in the narrative. These are divine policies enacted after the Great Flood to prevent future overpopulation. The interpretation is coherent and accounts for the myth's cultural function, but the interpretation struggles with certain details. Why does the text describe the gods as terrified by the flood they themselves unleashed? Why does it portray them as dependent on human offerings, swarming like flies around Atrahasis' sacrifice? Why does Bele regret her decision and weep for the humans she helped create? If this is purely a myth about divine sovereignty and human subordination, the gods should be portrayed as confident and in control. Instead, they are portrayed as having lost control, as having deployed a weapon that exceeded their expectations and produced consequences they regretted. The flood reads less like divine judgment and more like a strategic miscalculation in a conflict between divine factions. Enlil wanted to eliminate the problem permanently. Enki wanted to preserve the system with modifications. Enlil had the authority to decree the flood and the assembly's support to execute it. Enki lacked the authority to stop it, but retained the capability to sabotage it through selective preservation. The result was a catastrophe that nearly destroyed the entire framework, human and divine, and required emergency negotiation to salvage. If we read the flood as a weapon deliberately deployed in a divine factional conflict, other details align. The oath of secrecy suggests the plan's architects knew it was controversial and required coercion to maintain unity. Enki's violation of the oath suggests he considered the weapon illegitimate or disproportionate, worth risking divine punishment to prevent. The gods' terror during the flood suggests they underestimated its destructive capacity. The aftermath negotiation suggests the weapon's deployment created a crisis that forced compromise between previously irreconcilable positions. The flood also establishes a precedent that will haunt later narratives. Once a weapon of this magnitude has been deployed, the possibility of its deployment again becomes permanent. The Era epic, composed much later during the first millennium BC, describes a similar scenario where the plague god Era considers destroying humanity while Marduk is absent from his temple. The text explicitly references the earlier flood, suggesting that divine warfare through mass destruction was not a one-time event, but a recurring threat requiring constant vigilance. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest version of the flood story preserved in Sumerian on tablet CBS 1I673, provides less detail than Atrahasis, but confirms the same structure. Ziusudra, the Sumerian name for the flood hero, is warned by Enki through a wall. The flood comes, Ziusudra survives, the gods grant him eternal life. The pattern is identical, suggesting the story was stable across linguistic and temporal boundaries, preserved with remarkable consistency despite inevitable variations in emphasis and detail. What happened to the flood weapon after this deployment? The texts do not describe it being dismantled or forbidden. The gods who control water, Adad above, Enki below, retain their control. The capacity to deploy the weapon remains intact. What changes is the political will to use it, constrained by the memory of what happened last time. The flood becomes a historical precedent, a reminder of what can happen when divine factions cannot resolve their disputes through negotiation and resort to total warfare. The war the Anunnaki lost was not the flood itself. It was the conflict that made the flood seem necessary. Enlil lost because his final solution failed to achieve its objective. Humanity survived and continued. Enki lost because his faction could not prevent the weapon's deployment, only mitigate its effects. Humanity lost the most, reduced to near extinction, though the texts portray the survivors as ultimately benefiting from the new arrangement, living under a system with defined limits rather than arbitrary divine whims. But the hierarchy itself lost cohesion. The assembly that authorized the flood could not prevent its sabotage. The oath sworn by all the gods could not compel compliance. The authority structure demonstrated its fragility, and the factions within it demonstrated their willingness to wage total war when compromise failed. This would set the stage for the next major conflict, where a younger generation, witnessing the older generation's dysfunction, would conclude that the system itself required restructuring through force. Marduk's coup, restructuring heaven. The Enuma Elish, sometimes called the Babylonian creation epic, is often read as a creation myth, explaining how the world and humanity came into being. But careful attention to its structure reveals something more specific. It is a narrative of generational regime change, where a younger god seizes supreme authority by defeating an older generation in open warfare, claiming the Tablet of Destinies as proof of victory, and restructuring the divine hierarchy with himself at the apex. This is not creation from nothing, this is reorganization through conquest. And it is presented not as tragedy, but as necessity, as the inevitable outcome of an older system that had become unstable and required violent replacement. The text survives on 7 clay tablets, copied and recopied throughout the first millennium BC, recited annually during the Babylonian New Year festival, when the king would ritually reenact Marduk's victory to renew his own authority. The opening lines establish a time before the current order, when only the primordial waters existed, Apsu, the freshwater male, and Tiamat, the saltwater female. From their mingling, the first gods were born. These younger gods were noisy, disturbing Apsu's rest, creating the same complaint that would later drive Enlil to deploy the flood against humanity. Apsu proposes destroying the younger gods to restore quiet. Tiamat initially objects, arguing against killing their own offspring, but Apsu is determined. He convenes his vizier Mummu, and they plan the destruction in secret. The younger gods learn of the plot. E, the wisest among them, devises a counterstrike. He recites a spell that puts Apsu to sleep, and then kills him, claiming Apsu's dwelling, the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, as his own domain. E establishes his throne over Apsu's corpse, and fathers a son, Marduk, who is born with supernatural qualities, 4 eyes, 4 ears, flames shooting from his mouth when he speaks. The text emphasizes Marduk's superiority over other gods from birth, as if his arrival signals the arrival of something new, a divine being qualitatively different from the previous generations. Tiamat, initially reluctant to wage war, is persuaded by other gods who resent Ea's killing of Apsu and the younger generation's disruption of the old order. She prepares for war by creating an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, lion demons, scorpion men, storm demons, and elevates one of her allies, Kingu, as her champion and consort. To formalize his authority as commander of her forces, she gives him the Tablet of Destinies and fastens it upon his chest. This is the same tablet that An stole from Enlil, the instrument of supreme cosmic authority, now weaponized as part of Tiamat's command structure. The younger gods panic. E, despite his earlier success against Apsu, cannot face Tiamat. Anu volunteers, but retreats after seeing the scale of her forces. The Divine Assembly convenes in crisis, and Marduk is proposed as their champion. But Marduk imposes a condition before accepting. If he defeats Tiamat, the Assembly must grant him permanent supreme authority. His word will become law. His decrees will be unalterable. He will hold the position previously occupied by Anu and Enlil. The Assembly hesitates. This is an extraordinary demand, but necessity overcomes resistance. They test Marduk's power by placing a garment before him and commanding him to make it vanish and reappear through words alone. He does so. Satisfied that he possesses the necessary capability, they grant his request. Marduk is authorized to wage war with the promise of kingship as his reward. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is described with both mythological grandeur and tactical detail. Marduk arms himself with bow, arrows, a mace, lightning, a net held by the 4 winds, and 7 storms he created specifically for this confrontation. He rides a chariot pulled by terrifying steeds. When he confronts Tiamat, he challenges her directly, accusing her of betraying her offspring and elevating Kingu unjustly. Tiamat responds with a roar and launches her attack. Marduk releases the winds into her mouth as she opens it to strike, inflating her body until she cannot close her jaws. He shoots an arrow into her belly, piercing her heart. Tiamat dies. Marduk then turns to her army. Kingu and the other gods who sided with Tiamat are captured. Marduk takes the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu's chest, seals it with his own seal, and fastens it upon his own breast. This act is legally significant within the logic of the narrative. Marduk does not merely defeat Tiamat. He claims the instrument of authority from her defeated champion, marking the transfer of sovereignty through physical possession of the tablet. He then delivers the tablet to Anu, his grandfather, as both proof of victory and acknowledgement that authority flows through the generational hierarchy even as it is being restructured. What Marduk does next is the true act of creation. He splits Tiamat's corpse in half, using one half to create the sky and the other to create the earth. He organizes the cosmos, assigning gods to their stations, establishing the calendar, setting the movements of celestial bodies. He creates humanity from the blood of Kingu, the defeated commander, mixing it with clay to form workers who will serve the gods and free them from labour. This echoes the earlier creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic, but here the purpose is explicit. Humans exist to build temples and provide offerings so that gods can rest. The assembly of gods responds with gratitude and awe. They bestow upon Marduk 50 names, each representing a different aspect of divine authority. The number 50 is significant because it was previously associated with Enlil. The transfer of the 50 names from Enlil to Marduk signals the completion of the regime change. Enlil has not been killed or deposed formally, but his primacy has been absorbed by the younger god who now holds the Tablet of Destinies and commands the assembly's loyalty. Mainstream scholarship interprets the Enuma Elish as a political theology legitimizing Babylon's imperial dominance and Marduk's elevation within the pantheon. The text was composed or reached its final form during the Kassite or early Neo-Babylonian period, when Babylon was asserting supremacy over older Sumerian cult centres like Nippur and Eridu. By portraying Marduk as the saviour of the gods and creator of the current cosmic order, the text provides religious justification for Babylon's political authority. The myth explains why Marduk's temple, the Esagila, should receive resources and why Babylon's king should rule over other cities. It is ideology rendered as theology. But the text is also remarkably honest about the violence underlying the transition. Marduk does not inherit authority peacefully. He seizes it through warfare after the older generation's internal conflicts spiral into existential crisis. Tiamat goes to war because her consort was killed and her grievance was ignored. The younger gods elevate Marduk because their existing leaders, Ea and Anu, cannot resolve the crisis. Marduk demands kingship as payment before agreeing to fight, demonstrating that his service is transactional, not altruistic. The assembly grants his demand because they have no alternative. This is not divine harmony. This is political realism. The Enuma Elish also preserves a troubling implication about the sustainability of hierarchy. If the older generation's conflicts necessitated violent replacement by a younger generation, what prevents Marduk's order from eventually facing the same fate? The text does not address this directly, but the pattern it establishes, internal conflict, crisis, war, regime change, suggests that divine authority is not permanent. It is contingent on the ability to maintain order, and when order collapses, force determines succession. There is also the matter of Kingu's blood being used to create humanity. In the logic of the narrative, humans inherit something from the defeated god: his blood, his essence, his rationality. This is different from the Atrahasis version, where humanity is created from a slaughtered god named Waila, who had rationality but is not specified as being on the losing side of a war. In the Enuma Elish, humanity is created from the blood of a traitor, a rebel, a god who sided with Tiamat against the younger generation. Does this mean humans inherit a tendency toward rebellion? The text does not explore this implication, but later Mesopotamian literature frequently returns to the theme of human disobedience and divine frustration, as if the mixture of divine and rebellious elements in human nature produces perpetual instability. Marduk's victory restructures the cosmos, but it does not end divine conflict. The Era epic, composed during the first millennium BC, describes a crisis where Marduk temporarily leaves his temple and Era, the plague god, seizes the opportunity to wage destruction across Mesopotamia. The text portrays this as a catastrophe requiring Marduk's return to restore order, but the fact that it can happen at all indicates that Marduk's authority, like Enlil's before him, is contingent on his presence and active governance. Authority cannot be permanently secured. It requires constant maintenance and defence. The 50 names bestowed upon Marduk at the end of the Enuma Elish are worth examining because they reveal how authority was conceptualized in Mesopotamian thought. Each name represents a function or attribute: Marduk as farmer, Marduk as shepherd, Marduk as healer, Marduk as judge, Marduk as warrior. The accumulation of names is the accumulation of roles previously distributed among multiple gods. By holding all 50 names, Marduk becomes, in effect, the entire pantheon concentrated in one figure. This is theological consolidation mirroring political consolidation, as Babylon absorbed or subordinated other cities and their patron deities. But consolidation creates vulnerability. If all authority resides in one figure, that figure becomes a single point of failure. Enlil's system distributed authority among multiple gods: Anu in heaven, Enlil on earth, Enki in the Abzu, creating redundancy and balance, but also creating opportunities for conflict when the authorities disagreed. Marduk's system centralizes authority, reducing internal conflict, but increasing dependence on Marduk's continuous presence and competence. The later crises described in texts like the Era epic suggest the centralized system proved fragile in practice. The Enuma Elish ends with the gods celebrating Marduk's kingship, building him a magnificent temple, and praising his 50 names. It is a triumphant conclusion, but the triumph is built on the corpse of Tiamat, the blood of Kingu, and the coerced agreement of an assembly that had no other options. This is not order emerging naturally from chaos. This is one order replacing another through violence, justified retrospectively as necessary and beneficial, but achieved through methods that would be called conquest if applied to human politics. Marduk's war against Tiamat is often compared to Zeus's war against the Titans in Greek mythology or Odin's conflicts in Norse tradition. These are all generational wars where younger gods overthrow older primordial powers. The pattern suggests either a shared Indo-European mythological inheritance or a common human intuition about how authority transitions across generations, not smoothly through inheritance, but violently through revolution, when the older generation cannot or will not relinquish control. The Anunnaki did not lose the war to Tiamat. Marduk won decisively, but the hierarchy lost stability. The system that had functioned, however dysfunctionally, for generations, required total restructuring through total war, and the new system, centralized in Marduk, would prove vulnerable to different crises, described in later texts where his absence or inattention creates catastrophic vacuums. The war reshaped heaven, but it did not eliminate conflict. It only changed who held the weapons. The descent of Inanna, vertical warfare. Not all divine conflict in Mesopotamian literature occurs along horizontal axes, God against God within the same realm. Some conflicts occur vertically between the upper world of sky and earth and the lower world of death and shadow. The descent of Inanna into the underworld, preserved on 13 tablets excavated from Nippur and housed in various museum collections, describes a war between realms, waged not with armies but through protocol, stripping, execution, and negotiated resurrection. This is territorial warfare where the weapon is sovereignty itself, and the battlefield is the boundary between life and death. Inanna known as Ishtar in Akkadian sources, is the goddess of love, fertility, warfare and political power. Her cult was among the most prominent in Mesopotamia, with temples in Uruk, Akkad and Nineveh. She is portrayed as ambitious, violent, sexually assertive and politically cunning, a deity who accumulates power through seduction, theft and force in equal measure. In one famous narrative, she gets the god Enki drunk and steals the me, the divine powers, from him, bringing them to her city of Uruk, despite his attempts to recover them. She is not a goddess who accepts limits easily, so when she decides to descend to the underworld, the text frames it as an invasion, not a visit. The underworld is ruled by Ereshkigal, described in the text as Inanna's older sister, though the two goddesses rarely appear together in other narratives, suggesting their relationship may be more political than familial. Ereshkigal's husband, Gugalana, the Bull of Heaven, has recently been killed by Gilgamesh and Enkidu in another story, leaving Ereshkigal widowed and attending his funeral rites. Inanna's stated reason for descending is to attend the funeral, but the text strongly implies ulterior motives. She dresses in all her regalia, takes her 7 me of power, and instructs her servant Ninshaba to seek help from the great gods if she does not return within 3 days. These are not the preparations of a guest. These are the preparations of a conqueror who anticipates resistance. Inanna arrives at the first gate of the underworld and demands entry. The gatekeeper, Neti, asks why the Queen of Heaven has come to the land of no return. Inanna gives her cover story. She has come for the funeral rites. Neti reports to Ereshkigal, who is immediately suspicious. Ereshkigal instructs Neti to follow protocol, admit Inanna, but enforce the laws of the underworld. As Inanna passes through each of the 7 gates, she is required to remove one article of her divine regalia. At the first gate, her crown. At the second, her lapis lazuli necklace. At the third, her breastplate. At the fourth, her gold ring. At the fifth, her lapis measuring rod and line. At the sixth, her royal robe. At the 7th and final gate, she is stripped naked, entering Ereshkigal's throne room completely vulnerable, without any of the symbols or instruments of power she carried from above. This stripping process is procedurally detailed in the text, gate by gate, object by object, as if the ritual has legal significance. Inanna protests at each gate, asking why she is being treated this way, and at each gate she is told the same thing. Be silent, Inanna. The laws of the underworld are perfect. They must not be questioned. The repetition emphasizes that what is happening is not personal vendetta, but application of law. The underworld operates under different rules than the upper world, and those rules apply even to the Queen of Heaven. When Inanna enters the throne room, she attempts to seize Ereshkigal's throne. The text is explicit. She who had come from above pushed her aside and sat on her throne. This is not ambiguous. Inanna did not come for a funeral. She came to take control of the underworld by force. Ereshkigal's response is swift and devastating. She fixes the eye of death upon Inanna. Inanna dies on the spot. Her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall like a piece of meat. 3 days pass. Ninshaba, following Inanna's instructions, goes to Enlil and begs for help. Enlil refuses, saying Inanna got what she deserved for trying to seize power that was not hers. Ninshaba goes to Nanna, the moon god, Inanna's father. He also refuses. Finally, Ninshaba goes to Enki, who agrees to help. Enki creates 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails, genderless creatures who can slip past the underworld's defences because they do not fit its categories. He instructs them to sympathise with Ereshkigal's pain, to mourn with her, and in exchange for their empathy, to ask for the corpse on the wall. The 2 creatures descend, find Ereshkigal in agony, and perform their task. They mourn with her. She is surprised by their compassion. No one in the underworld shows compassion and offers them a gift. They ask for the corpse. Ereshkigal grants it, and they sprinkle it with the water of life and the food of life that Enki provided. Inanna revives. But the laws of the underworld cannot be violated. No one who enters can leave without providing a substitute. Inanna must send someone to take her place. Inanna ascends, accompanied by demons who will seize her replacement. She encounters Ninshuba, loyal and mourning, and refuses to send her. She encounters her sons, mourning and dressed in rags, and refuses to send them. Finally, she arrives at Uruk and finds her husband, Dumuzi, sitting on a throne in fine clothes, not mourning at all. Enraged by his indifference to her death, she hands him over to the demons. Dumuzi flees, but is eventually caught. A compromise is reached. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the underworld, and his sister Geshtinanna will spend the other half, ensuring the law is satisfied while splitting the burden. Mainstream scholarship interprets Inanna's descent as a myth explaining seasonal cycles. Dumuzi's time in the underworld corresponds to the dry season when vegetation dies, and his return corresponds to the rainy season when life returns. The narrative is read as agricultural allegory, with Inanna representing fertility that must die and be reborn annually. This interpretation accounts for the myth's ritual function, as Inanna's descent was reenacted in religious ceremonies throughout Mesopotamia. But the agricultural reading does not fully account for the political and territorial dimensions of the narrative. Inanna does not descend passively. She invades, wearing her full regalia, carrying her instruments of power, preparing for resistance. Her attempt to seize Ereshkigal's throne is unambiguous territorial aggression. Ereshkigal's execution of Inanna is not arbitrary cruelty, but defense of sovereignty. Inanna violated the laws of the underworld and attempted usurpation, and the penalty for that is death. The text also reveals the limits of Inanna's power. In the upper world, she is one of the most powerful deities, commanding armies, toppling kings, seducing gods. But in the underworld, stripped of her regalia and me, she is powerless. This suggests that divine authority is not intrinsic, but contingent on context and instruments. Remove the symbols, and the power disappears. The underworld's gatekeepers understand this, which is why they enforce the stripping protocol. By the time Inanna reaches Ereshkigal, she has been systematically disarmed. Enki's willingness to rescue Inanna is also revealing. Enlil and Nanna refuse, judging Inanna's attempt as illegitimate overreach. Enki, as always, takes a different position. He does not defend Inanna's actions, but he also does not believe she should remain dead. His solution is characteristically clever. Send beings who exist outside the underworld's legal categories, exploit Ereshkigal's vulnerability through empathy, and retrieve Inanna through negotiation rather than force. The strategy works, but it requires compliance with underworld law. Inanna cannot simply leave. She must provide a substitute, and the substitute must be someone who failed in their obligations to her. Dumuzi, by not mourning, by not honouring her death, becomes the legitimate target. The descent narrative establishes that the cosmos is not unified under a single hierarchy. The underworld operates under separate sovereignty with separate laws, and the gods of the upper world cannot simply override it. Inanna's failure demonstrates that even the most powerful deities have jurisdictional limits. Ereshkigal rules the underworld absolutely, and even the Queen of Heaven must submit to her authority when entering her domain. This has implications for understanding divine warfare in Mesopotamian cosmology. Wars are not only fought between peers within the same realm, they are also fought across realms, between upper and lower, sky and abyss, life and death. These vertical conflicts follow different rules than horizontal conflicts. They are not about seizing the Tablet of Destinies or restructuring the assembly. They are about respecting or violating boundaries between separate sovereign domains. Inanna's descent is one of the few narratives where the invader loses. She attempts to expand her authority vertically into a realm where her power does not extend, and she is executed for it. Her resurrection is not a reversal of Ereshkigal's judgment, but a negotiated compromise that satisfies the underworld's legal requirements. The war ends not with Inanna's victory, but with the reaffirmation that the underworld's sovereignty is inviolable and that attempts to breach it have permanent consequences. The demons who accompany Inanna back to the upper world are reminders of this. They are enforcers of underworld law operating above ground, ensuring the substitute is delivered as required. They represent the underworld's power to reach into the upper world when its laws have been invoked, demonstrating that vertical boundaries are permeable in both directions when legal obligations are created. The cycle of Dumuzi and Geshtinana, spending alternating time in the underworld, becomes permanent, a recurring cost imposed on Inanna's household for her attempted invasion. This is not symbolic death and rebirth. This is punitive extraction, the underworld claiming ongoing tribute as restitution for the violation of its sovereignty. The agricultural fertility that results, the seasonal cycle of death and life, is a byproduct of this arrangement, not its purpose. Inanna's failed invasion demonstrates that even the most aggressive and ambitious deities cannot simply conquer all domains. The cosmos contains multiple sovereignties, each absolute within its own realm, and crossing those boundaries requires either permission or payment. Inanna attempted to cross without either, and the cost was temporary death, permanent loss of her husband for half the year, and the humiliation of being stripped naked, executed, and hung on a hook like carrion. The underworld was never conquered. Ereshkigal remained queen, her authority unchallenged and reinforced through Inanna's failure. The vertical war ended with the upper world acknowledging the lower world's sovereignty and paying ongoing tribute to maintain peace. This is not the pattern we have seen in horizontal conflicts, where wars end with regime change and restructuring. This is the pattern of a war lost, terms accepted, and a new arrangement imposed by the victor. The Anunnaki's conflicts were not limited to sky and earth. They extended into the abyss, and in that domain they did not always win. Error and the plague of the gods. The Error epic, preserved on tablets dating to the 1st millennium BC with copies held in the British Museum and other collections, describes a divine conflict of a different nature, not a war of succession or territorial expansion, but a war of chaos unleashed during a power vacuum waged by a god of plague and destruction who nearly annihilates Babylon and its people while Marduk is absent from his temple. This is warfare through opportunism, where the temporary withdrawal of authority creates space for subordinate powers to act without restraint, and the result is catastrophe requiring emergency intervention. Error is the Akkadian god of plague, mayhem and violence, associated with warfare, fever and mass death. He is not a rebel seeking kingship, nor is he portrayed as particularly ambitious. He is a force of destruction that exists within the divine hierarchy, but requires containment through active governance. When governance lapses, Error acts. The epic begins with Error growing restless. His weapons are rusting. His warriors, the Sabiti, 7 fierce gods who serve as his strike force, are idle. They urge him to action, reminding him of his power and suggesting that Babylon has grown complacent and deserves punishment. Error is tempted but hesitates because Marduk, the king of the gods, is present in Babylon and his authority constrains Error's actions. So Error devises a plan. He approaches Marduk and criticizes the condition of Marduk's regalia, suggesting the divine garments have grown dull and require refurbishment. The only way to properly restore them is for Marduk to leave Babylon temporarily and travel to the Apsu, where the craftsman gods can do the work properly. Marduk is concerned leaving Babylon unprotected could lead to disaster, but Error promises to maintain order in his absence. Marduk agrees and departs. The moment Marduk is gone, Error unleashes destruction. He incites war among Babylon's neighbours. He sends plague into the cities. He drives the gods to madness, causing them to abandon their proper roles and turn on humanity. The text describes widespread slaughter, cities burning, social order collapsing, children turning against parents, priests abandoning temples, wild animals invading settlements. Error's violence is not strategic, it is total, indiscriminate, driven by rage rather than policy. The Sebeti amplify the destruction, each contributing their own form of devastation, fire, disease, famine, slaughter, terror, madness, and annihilation. The god Isum, Error's vizier and counselor, attempts to restrain him, asking why he is destroying the very cities he is supposed to protect. Error's response is revealing. He claims Marduk's authority has made the gods weak and humanity arrogant. By unleashing destruction, Error is testing whether the system can survive without constant divine intervention. He is also punishing Marduk for neglect. The temple needed maintenance, the gods needed attention, humanity needed discipline. Marduk's absence proves his governance is insufficient, and Error is demonstrating what happens when authority lapses. But the destruction spirals beyond even Error's intentions. Babylon, the sacred city, the centre of Marduk's cult, begins to collapse. The text describes the gods themselves fleeing in terror, unable to stop what Error has unleashed. Isum continues pleading with Error, reminding him that destroying Babylon means destroying the system that sustains the gods. Without temples, without offerings, without human labour, the gods themselves will suffer. Error begins to recognise the problem. He has proven his point, but at catastrophic cost. Marduk returns, sees the devastation, and confronts Error directly. The confrontation is not violent. Marduk does not fight Error, but it is absolute. Marduk's presence alone reasserts order. Error's rage subsides. The Sebeti stand down. The gods return to their proper roles. Marduk begins the process of rebuilding, restoring temples, repopulating cities, re-establishing the worship system. But the damage is permanent. Entire cities have been destroyed. Entire populations have been wiped out. The text ends with a blessing on those who recite the epic, as if the narrative itself serves an apotropaic function. By speaking Error's name and recounting his deeds, one acknowledges his power and appeases his potential for future violence. Mainstream scholarship interprets the Error epic as a theological explanation for the destruction Babylon suffered during the 8th century BC, when Assyrian invasions, internal rebellions, and political instability ravaged the city. The epic provides a divine explanation for historical catastrophe Babylon suffered because Marduk temporarily withdrew his protection, allowing Error to act. This reading accounts for the text's cultural function, offering meaning to disaster and reassurance that order will eventually be restored through Marduk's return. But the text also preserves a darker political theology. It acknowledges that divine authority is contingent on presence. Marduk's kingship means nothing if he is absent from his temple, and his absence creates a power vacuum that subordinate gods will exploit. Error does not technically rebel. He does not claim Marduk's throne or seize the Tablet of Destinies, but he acts as if Marduk's authority does not constrain him, and the result is functionally indistinguishable from divine civil war. The Error epic also demonstrates the limits of centralized authority. Marduk's consolidation of power in the Enuma Elish created a system where all order depends on his active governance. When he withdraws, even temporarily, the system collapses. This is the vulnerability of centralization, efficiency and unity in peace, but catastrophic failure when the central authority is absent or incapacitated. Enlil's older system, with authority distributed among multiple gods, was more dysfunctional in operation, but more resilient in crisis. If Enlil withdrew, Enki and Anu could still maintain basic order. If Marduk withdraws, Error is unleashed, and no one can stop him until Marduk returns. The relationship between Error and Marduk is also telling. Error is not an enemy. He is part of the system, a subordinate god with a specific function, war, plague, violence, that serves the hierarchy when properly directed. But when authority lapses, Error's function becomes autonomous and destructive, no longer serving policy, but acting according to his own nature. This suggests that the divine hierarchy contains inherently destabilizing elements that require constant management, and that management is not philosophical or theological but personal. It depends on Marduk's physical presence and active attention. The Sebeti, Error's 7 warriors, are described in the text with titles that evoke natural disasters: floodstorm, conflagration, famine, searing heat, darkness, fever, and death. These are not symbolic abstractions. They are forces that Error can deploy against cities, and once deployed, they act with autonomy, requiring Error's command to cease. The text describes them as being difficult to control even for Error. They are eager for violence, pushing him toward action, amplifying his rage. This suggests a model of divine power where subordinate forces have their own agency, and governance consists of restraining and directing them rather than exercising absolute control. Ishram's role as counsellor is critical. He is the voice of reason attempting to moderate Error's rage, the one who reminds Error of consequences and limits. But Ishram cannot command Error. He can only advise, warn, and plead. The relationship mirrors the relationship between Enki and Enlil in earlier texts, one faction advocating for restraint, the other driven by rage or policy, with outcomes determined by which voice prevails in the moment. The difference is that in the Error epic, restraint does not fully prevail until after catastrophic damage has been done. The epic also contains a fascinating detail about Marduk's regalia. Error's pretext for convincing Marduk to leave Babylon is that the divine garments need refurbishment, implying that even Marduk's authority is dependent on material symbols that require maintenance. This echoes the earlier pattern with the Tablet of Destinies. Authority is not purely spiritual or intrinsic, but connected to physical objects that can be worn, maintained, lost, or stolen. If Marduk's garments are dull, his authority is diminished, and even he recognizes the need to restore them. This creates a vulnerability Error exploits. The destruction described in the Error epic is more comprehensive than the flood in some ways, because it is not limited to humanity. The flood targeted humans, but left the gods intact. Error's rampage targets the entire system: cities, temples, priests, gods, social order, cosmic order. It is destruction for its own sake, and it nearly succeeds in collapsing everything. Only Marduk's return prevents total annihilation. The aftermath is also significant. Marduk does not punish Error. There is no trial, no exile, no demotion. Error remains in his position with his function intact, because the system still requires a god of plague and warfare. What changes is Marduk's recognition that he cannot afford to be absent, that his authority requires continuous vigilance, and that the hierarchy contains forces that will exploit any lapse in governance. This is not a resolution. This is an acknowledgement of permanent instability requiring permanent management. The Error epic is one of the few Mesopotamian texts that describes the gods as vulnerable, not to external enemies, but to their own subordinates, acting without restraint. It is a narrative of systemic failure, where the structure itself nearly collapses because the mechanisms holding it together, Marduk's presence, Ishram's counsel, the god's self-restraint, prove insufficient when tested. The war Error wages is not against Marduk personally, but against the order Marduk represents. And while Marduk ultimately prevails, the cost is staggering and the lesson is grim, authority is fragile, order is contingent, and the forces of chaos are always present within the hierarchy, waiting for the moment when restraint fails. The king list's hidden war. The Sumerian king list, preserved most completely on the Weld-Blundell prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum and catalogued in multiple fragmentary versions across cuneiform collections, is typically read as a chronological record of Mesopotamian dynasties, but careful attention to its language and structure reveals something more disturbing: a pattern of violent regime changes, dynasties that were struck down, and kingship that descended or was carried off from one city to another as if political authority itself was a contested object moving through conquest rather than peaceful succession. The prism is a clay artifact approximately 20 centimetres tall, four-sided, with each side inscribed in 2 columns. It was excavated from Lhasa in 1922 by British archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell and subsequently donated to the Ashmolean, where it remains on display. The text begins with the famous opening line, "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." This phrase is critical. Kingship did not originate on earth through human innovation. It descended, implying a divine transfer, a deliberate act by the gods to establish terrestrial authority at a specific location, Eridu, the cult centre of Enki, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition. The list then proceeds through a sequence of antediluvian kings, rulers who supposedly reigned before the flood, each for impossibly long periods ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Mainstream scholarship interprets these enormous reigns as either symbolic, corrupted numbers or a different counting system, possibly representing dynasties rather than individuals. But the pattern is consistent. Kingship resides in one city, passes through a succession of rulers, and then moves to another city. The formula that marks these transitions varies, but certain phrases recur: was defeated in battle, was struck down, was carried off, or simply kingship was taken to. After the flood section, which mentions briefly that the flood swept over, kingship resumes with the statement, after the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Again, the language is significant. Kingship is lowered, descending from divine authority to a new terrestrial location. The post-Diluvian dynasties have shorter but still extraordinary reigns, hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, and the transitions between dynasties often include military language. The first dynasty of Kish ends with the note Kish was struck down with weapons. Kingship moves to Eanna Uruk. The first dynasty of Uruk ends, and kingship moves to Ur. The first dynasty of Ur ends, and kingship returns to Kish. The pattern repeats dozens of times throughout the list. Kingship is never permanently settled. It moves from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, sometimes peacefully, but often violently. Certain phrases are particularly telling. Struck down is a term used elsewhere in Sumerian texts to describe military defeat and destruction. Carried off suggests forcible removal. The fact that kingship moves suggests it is conceived as a physical or transferable thing, not merely a status or recognition, but an object or power that can be seized, lost, and relocated. The king list also includes details that hint at internal conflicts beyond simple city rivalries. Several dynasties overlap chronologically, suggesting that multiple cities claimed kingship simultaneously, which would indicate contested succession or civil war rather than unified succession. Some rulers are listed with minimal detail, just a name and reign length, while others are described with epithets: the divine one, the hero, the king who made the land tremble. The variation suggests that some rulers were remembered as particularly significant, possibly because they achieved kingship through extraordinary means. The most intriguing sections involve rulers explicitly associated with divine parentage or divine support. Gilgamesh, the famous hero, appears in the king list as a historical king of Uruk, son of a Lilu demon and a high priestess. His reign is listed as 126 years, and he is described as the divine one who made the land secure. But other texts, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, describe him as oppressive, defying the gods, and requiring divine intervention to restrain his tyranny. The king list's positive portrayal suggests either ideological revision or that legitimacy was always retrospectively assigned to successful rulers regardless of their methods. The list also contains curiosities that disrupt the linear narrative. At several points, it notes that a city held kingship twice, or even 3 times, separated by intervening dynasties elsewhere. This suggests that cities could lose and regain kingship, indicating a dynamic political landscape where power was contested and reclaimed rather than permanently transferred. The second dynasty of Kish, for example, follows the first dynasty of Lagash, suggesting Kish reclaimed kingship after losing it earlier. If kingship is divine authorization, why would the gods transfer it, then transfer it back, then transfer it again? The pattern makes more sense if kingship represents political and military dominance rather than unchanging divine preference. Mainstream scholarship treats the king list as a mixture of mythology, propaganda, and historical memory. The antediluvian section is considered purely legendary. The post-diluvian section a blend of legend and history, with increasing historical reliability as the list approaches contemporary periods. The enormous reign lengths are explained through various theories: confusion between individuals and dynasties, sexagesimal number corruption, symbolic rather than literal time. The purpose of the list, scholars argue, was to legitimize Isin's claim to Sumerian hegemony in the early 2nd millennium BC by demonstrating an unbroken succession of kingship leading to Isin's own dynasty. But the legitimization reading does not explain why the text includes so much evidence of discontinuity and violence. If the purpose is to demonstrate legitimate succession, why emphasize that dynasties were struck down and kingship carried off? Why include overlapping dynasties that undermine the claim of unbroken succession? Why preserve the memory of conflict and defeat if the goal is to portray divine order and continuity? One possibility is that the king list preserves a more honest historical memory than its ideological function would require. The scribes compiling the list had access to earlier king lists, year names, and administrative records from various cities. They inherited traditions that included military conflicts, dynastic collapses, and regime changes. When they compiled the unified list, they preserved those traditions even when they contradicted the neat narrative of continuous succession, because altering the traditional material would have undermined the list's authority as historical record. Another possibility is that the violence is intentional. The king list serves not only to legitimize Isin, but to demonstrate a pattern. Kingship moves through conquest, and whoever holds military superiority holds divine authorization. By showing that kingship has always moved through striking down previous holders, the list normalizes Isin's own rise through force. It establishes that this is how kingship works. You take it, you hold it as long as you can, and eventually someone stronger takes it from you. The antediluvian section's impossibly long reigns might preserve a memory of a different kind of governance, where rulers or ruling entities operated on timescales beyond human norms. If the Anunnaki themselves held kingship before the flood, and if they operated with lifespans or institutional continuities that humans could not match, the enormous reign lengths make sense, as literal records translated into the only numerical framework available to later scribes. The flood then becomes the decisive break. After it, kingship operates on human timescales with human rulers, but the pattern of violent succession continues because the underlying dynamic has not changed, authority is contested, and force determines succession. The king list also reveals a geography of conflict. Kingship moves between Kish, Uruk-ul, Lagash, Adab, Mari, Akshak, Akkad, and eventually Isin. These are not neighbouring villages, but major urban centres separated by significant distances, each with its own patron deity, its own economic base, its own political interests. The movement of kingship between them suggests not local rivalries, but regional hegemonic struggles, where the dominant city controlled not just its immediate hinterland, but claimed sovereignty over the entire Sumerian plain. Several transitions in the king list align with archaeological evidence of destruction layers, burned cities, and settlement disruptions. The transition from the 3rd dynasty of Uruk to the 1st dynasty of Ur, for example, corresponds roughly to a period of significant political upheaval visible in the material record. The end of the Akkadian dynasty, explicitly noted in the list as being struck down by Gutian invaders, matches historical records of the Akkadian collapse. The list is not purely legendary. It is grounded in real events, even when the details are mythologized or numerically exaggerated. The phrase kingship descended from heaven is repeated at the beginning and after the flood, but it never appears in mid-list transitions. Kingship does not descend from heaven to Uruk after Kish falls. It is taken to Uruk. The language shift is revealing. The initial descent is divine transfer. Subsequent movements are terrestrial transfers accomplished through human or divine action, but no longer requiring direct heavenly intervention. This suggests that once kingship entered the terrestrial realm, it became subject to terrestrial dynamics, conflict, conquest, seizure, even if the authority itself retained divine origins. The king list preservation across multiple copies and its continued use into the 1st millennium BC indicates it was considered authoritative, not merely by one city or dynasty, but across Mesopotamian scribal culture. Students learned it. Administrators referenced it. Priests recited it. The pattern it preserved, that kingship moves through violence, that dynasties rise and fall, that no city holds authority permanently, became foundational knowledge about how political power operates. If the Anunnaki wars we have been examining, Igigi rebellion, Anzi's theft, Enlil-Enki rivalry, the flood, Marduk's coup, Inanna's invasion, Era's rampage, if these conflicts shaped early Mesopotamian governance, then the king list preserves their aftermath. It records the terrestrial consequences of divine instability, where kingship that descended from heaven became a prize fought over by cities whose rulers claimed divine patronage, but whose authority was contested through force. The list does not describe divine wars directly, but it describes the political system those wars produced, one where legitimate succession does not exist, where every dynasty eventually falls, and where kingship itself is the weapon, the prize, and the justification for endless conflict. The Anunnaki's war was not one war. It was a pattern of wars whose logic embedded itself into Mesopotamian political culture, preserved most clearly in the document that was supposed to legitimize kingship, but instead revealed its fundamental instability. What mainstream scholars say and don't say. When modern Assyriologists, historians, and mythographers examine the texts we have been exploring, they arrive at interpretations fundamentally different from the reading this script has pursued. The academic consensus is neither ignorant nor dishonest. It is built on rigorous methodology, linguistic expertise, archaeological context, and comparative analysis. But it is also built on assumptions about what ancient texts can and cannot mean, and those assumptions create blind spots, details the texts preserve that conventional interpretation struggles to explain. It is worth examining both what mainstream scholarship says and what it leaves unsaid. The standard academic interpretation treats Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives as theology, mythology, and political ideology, not as historical records. Enlil and Enki are theological concepts personified, representing complementary principles of governance, force and wisdom, authority and cunning. Their conflicts are narrative explorations of these tensions, not records of actual disputes. The Igigi rebellion is an etiological myth explaining why humans must labour. The Tablet of Destinies is a symbol of legitimate authority. Anzi's theft and Ninurta's recovery are narratives legitimising Ninurta's cult. The flood is a theological explanation for natural disasters and human mortality. Marduk's defeat of Tiamat is Babylonian imperial propaganda, elevating Marduk above older Sumerian gods. Inanna's descent explains seasonal cycles and the power of death. The Era epic provides meaning to historical catastrophe. The Sumerian king list is a mixture of legend, propaganda, and historical memory, growing more reliable closer to the compilation date. These interpretations are internally consistent. They account for the text's cultural functions, how they were used in religious ceremonies, how they legitimize political authority, how they provided explanatory frameworks for natural phenomena and human experience. They situate the texts within their archaeological and linguistic contexts, comparing similar narratives across ancient Near Eastern cultures, Egyptian, Hittite, Ugaritic, Canaanite, and identifying common mythological patterns that suggest shared cultural developments or diffusion through trade and conquest. But certain details resist these interpretations. Why does the Atrahasis epic describe the Igigi rebellion with such procedural specificity, council meetings, collective action, siege tactics, negotiation sequences? If this is pure mythology, why include details about who said what to whom in what order? Why describe Enlil's strategic thinking as he escalates from plague to drought to embargo to flood? Why preserve Enki's casuistic defence when confronted after the flood, his argument that he didn't technically violate the oath because he spoke to a wall, not a human? These are not the details of allegory. These are the details of institutional process, the kind of procedural memory that accumulates when scribes record real events and transmit them through tradition. The Tablet of Destinies presents similar problems. Academic interpretation treats it as a symbol, but the texts describe it as an object, something that can be worn on the chest, stolen from a throne room, carried in flight, recovered through battle, transferred to a new holder. The defensive capabilities Anne's gains from possessing it are described with tactical precision, arrows turn to reeds, weapons return to their raw materials, spells lose their force. If this is purely symbolic, the symbolism is unusually technical. The strategic problem the gods face, how to defeat an enemy wielding ultimate authority, is solved through tactics, not through divine fiat. Ninurta overwhelms the tablet's defences through saturation fire, shooting too many arrows too quickly for the defensive system to counter. This is not symbolic victory through righteousness. This is tactical victory through exploiting a technical limitation. Mainstream scholars would respond that ancient texts frequently combine theological symbolism with concrete detail as a literary technique to make abstract concepts tangible. The Tablet of Destinies is abstract authority rendered as a physical object to facilitate narrative drama. Ninurta's tactical solution is a narrative device to create suspense and demonstrate his heroism. The procedural detail in the Igigi rebellion is world-building, making the divine realm feel real and relatable to human audiences familiar with labour disputes and political assemblies. This response is reasonable, and it explains much, but it does not explain why the procedural detail is so consistent across multiple texts composed over centuries. If different scribes in different periods were independently inventing concrete details to dramatize abstract concepts, we would expect variation and contradiction. Instead, we find remarkable consistency. The Tablet of Destinies functions the same way in the Anne's myth and the Anu Marilish. Enki employs the same casuistic reasoning in the Atrahasis flood and the Eridu Genesis flood. The pattern of divine conflict followed by negotiated compromise repeats across narratives. This consistency suggests the details are not invented for dramatic effect, but preserved from a shared tradition that scribes considered authoritative. Mainstream scholarship also struggles with the sheer quantity of divine conflict in Mesopotamian literature. If these gods represent cosmic order, why are they constantly fighting each other? The standard answer is that conflict narratives dramatize the process by which order emerges from chaos, with each conflict representing a stage in that emergence. But the conflicts do not stop once order is established. Error's rampage occurs after Marduk has already reorganized the cosmos. Inanna's invasion of the underworld occurs within a functioning divine hierarchy. The Enlil-Enki rivalry persists across multiple crises despite both gods holding established positions. The Sumerian king list records violent dynastic changes continuing through historical periods. The conflicts are not stages of emergence, but ongoing features of the system. Some scholars have suggested that Mesopotamian religion was fundamentally different from later monotheistic traditions, conceptualizing divinity as inherently plural and contested rather than unified and omnipotent. In this view, the gods' conflicts reflect an ancient understanding of reality as shaped by competing forces requiring constant negotiation and balance, never achieving permanent stability. This interpretation has merit, and it accounts for why the texts never resolve divine conflict permanently, because permanent resolution would be theologically incoherent within a polytheistic framework where multiple autonomous powers coexist. But even within polytheistic frameworks, there are alternatives to constant conflict. Greek mythology includes divine conflicts, but they mostly occur in the distant past during the Titanomachy and Gigantomachy, after which Zeus establishes a relatively stable Olympian order. Norse mythology anticipates Ragnarok, the apocalyptic final battle, but the intervening period is one of maintained, if fragile, order. Egyptian mythology includes conflicts between Set and Osiris, Horus and Set, but these are framed as exceptions to cosmic balance rather than the normal state. Mesopotamian mythology is unusual in portraying divine conflict as continuous, persistent, and structural rather than exceptional. The alternative reading this script has pursued treats the texts not as theology or mythology, but as records, fragmentary, mythologized, reinterpreted across generations, but ultimately grounded in events that actually occurred. In this reading, the Anunnaki were a historical ruling hierarchy, possibly human, possibly something else, whose internal conflicts were preserved by scribes in the only conceptual vocabulary available, divine conflict. The Agigi rebellion was a labour revolt. The Tablet of Destinies was a control technology or instrument of authority. Anzi's theft was a coup attempt. The Enlil-Enki rivalry was a factional dispute within the ruling elite. The flood was a weapon deployed in that dispute. Marduk's rise was a generational regime change. Inanna's invasion was territorial expansion. The Era epic recorded the consequences of leadership failure. The king list recorded the terrestrial dynasties that claimed descent or authorization from this hierarchy, perpetuating its patterns of violent succession. This reading is speculative, and mainstream scholars would rightly demand evidence beyond textual interpretation, archaeological artifacts, linguistic corroboration, comparative precedents from other cultures. That evidence is either absent or ambiguous. No archaeologist has found the Tablet of Destinies or anything clearly analogous to it. No excavation has uncovered physical evidence of a non-human ruling hierarchy. The texts themselves were composed centuries or millennia after the events they purportedly describe, allowing ample time for mythologization, ideological revision, and literary invention. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the textual patterns remain striking. The consistency across sources, the procedural detail, the tactical sophistication, the honest portrayal of divine dysfunction and failure, the preservation of conflicts that do not serve any obvious theological or political purpose. These elements suggest the texts are preserving something more than invention. What mainstream scholarship does not say, because academic methodology prohibits speculation without evidentiary grounds, is that the texts might be literally true, not symbolically true, not metaphorically true, but literally true as records of actual events involving actual entities whose conflicts shaped early Mesopotamian history. This possibility is professionally unthinkable within Assyriology, and for good reason. Entertaining it without extraordinary evidence would undermine scholarly rigour. But the possibility remains conceptually coherent, and it explains details that symbolic and mythological interpretations struggle to address. The question is not whether mainstream scholars are wrong. The question is whether their interpretive framework, built on sound methodological principles, might be excluding a possibility that the ancient scribes themselves considered self-evident, that the gods were real, that their conflicts were real, and that the texts preserve memory of those conflicts, however fragmentary and mythologized, because forgetting them entirely would have been dangerous. The Sumerians did not treat these texts as fiction. They copied them for millennia. They taught them to students. They recited them in temples. They structured rituals around them. They organised their political theology through them. Perhaps they did so because the texts served ideological functions, or perhaps they did so because the texts were true, and truth required preservation even when it could no longer be fully understood. What the texts say, when read closely without pre-commitment to any interpretive framework, is that the Anunnaki fought wars among themselves, that those wars were catastrophic, that they were never fully resolved, and that their legacy shaped Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. Mainstream scholarship explains this as mythology. This script has explored the possibility that it was history, the war that still echoes. The fragment sits in its vault, catalogued and preserved, CBS Den 673. The cuneiform is still legible where the clay has not worn away. Each wedge-shaped mark, pressed by a reed stylus 4,000 years ago, recording something the scribe believed worth preserving. When kingship descended from heaven, when the gods went to war, when the flood swept over, when humanity survived because one god defied the assembly's decree. The tablet does not explain why these events mattered. It assumes the reader already knows, already understands, that what happened then shaped everything that came after. We have followed the trajectory from that fragment through a dozen conflicts preserved across as many texts. The Igigi, who rebelled against their labour. Ans, who stole the Tablet of Destinies and was hunted down by Ninurta. Enlil and Enki locked in perpetual opposition over humanity's fate. The flood deployed as a final solution and sabotaged by one brother against another. Marduk's generational coup that restructured heaven through violence. Inanna's failed invasion of the underworld. Era's rampage during Marduk's absence. The king list's record of dynasties struck down and kingship carried off. Each conflict follows different logic, involves different actors, produces different outcomes. But together they describe a pattern. The Anunnaki were never unified. Their hierarchy was contested from within. Their wars shaped both divine and terrestrial politics, and the system they created, transmitted to Sumerian cities, perpetuated their logic of authority maintained through force, legitimacy claimed through victory, and order sustained through constant vigilance against internal challenge. Whether these texts preserve literal history, mythologized memory, or pure theological imagination, the pattern they describe is consistent across 3 millennia of Mesopotamian literature. Divine conflict is not exceptional, it is structural. Authority is not permanent, it is contested. Order is not given, it is imposed, defended, and eventually overthrown. These principles are not unique to Mesopotamian thought. They appear in Greek, Norse, Hindu, and Mesoamerican mythologies, but nowhere else are they developed with such procedural precision, such tactical detail, such institutional complexity. The academic consensus interprets these texts as mythology serving theological and political functions within ancient Near Eastern cultures. That interpretation is coherent, methodologically sound, and accounts for most of the evidence. But it does not account for everything. It does not fully explain the consistency of detail across independent sources. It does not explain why the texts preserve conflicts that serve no obvious ideological purpose. It does not explain why divine authority is portrayed as so fragile, so dependent on specific objects, like the Tablet of Destinies, so vulnerable to theft, sabotage, and violent overthrow. If these are purely symbolic narratives, the symbolism is remarkably consistent in depicting divine governance as dysfunctional, factional, and sustained through force rather than consensus. The alternative reading, that these texts preserve memory of actual conflicts among a ruling hierarchy that the Sumerians understood as gods, remains speculative. There is no archaeological proof. There are no contemporary inscriptions saying this is history, not myth. The texts themselves were composed centuries after the events they describe, transmitted through oral tradition and scribal copying, revised and reinterpreted by successive generations. But speculative does not mean incoherent. If the Anunnaki were real entities, human or otherwise, whose internal conflicts shaped early Mesopotamia, the texts we have examined would look much like what we would expect to survive: fragmentary, mythologized, but preserving procedural and tactical details that pure invention would not likely generate consistently across independent sources. What matters is not resolving whether the texts are literally true. What matters is recognizing what they preserve. They preserve a model of authority as contested and violent. They preserve a record of conflicts between factions within a ruling elite. They preserve procedural and tactical details suggesting institutional memory. They preserve the pattern that whoever holds ultimate authority, the Tablet of Destinies, the 50 Names, kingship itself, holds it only as long as they can defend it. And that defence requires constant effort against internal and external challenges. This pattern embedded itself in Mesopotamian political culture. The Sumerian king list records it directly. Kingship moves from city to city through being struck down, not through peaceful succession. The historical record confirms it. Sumerian city-states waged perpetual war against each other. The Akkadian Empire conquered them, then collapsed under internal rebellion and external invasion. The Babylonian Empire rose, restructuring the pantheon to elevate Marduk, then fell to Assyria. Assyria fell to Babylon. Babylon fell to Persia. The pattern never breaks. Authority is seized, held, and lost. Order requires force. Legitimacy follows victory. Whether the Anunnaki taught this pattern to humans or humans projected their own political experience onto divine narratives, the result is the same. A civilization structured around the principle that conflict is eternal, order is temporary, and war is the mechanism through which authority transfers. This is not moral judgment. This is observation. The texts do not celebrate this reality. They describe it with a tone that ranges from procedural neutrality to tragic resignation. The gods weep during the flood. They cower in fear at the destruction they unleashed. They regret their decisions. But they do not fundamentally change. The conflicts continue. The war the Anunnaki lost was not any single conflict. It was the war for permanent stability. They never achieved it. Enlil's authority was stolen by Ans and required military recovery. His flood plan was sabotaged by Enki. His supremacy was absorbed by Marduk. Marduk's centralized authority proved vulnerable to Era's opportunism during his absence. Inanna's ambition was stopped by Ereshkigal. The Igigi rebellion forced structural reorganization. The pattern across all these conflicts is that no solution lasts. Every resolution creates the conditions for the next crisis. Every victory sows the seeds of the next challenge. This is the war that still echoes. It echoes in the king list's endless succession of dynasties struck down. It echoes in the archaeological record of burned cities and collapsed civilizations. It echoes in later mythologies that borrowed and adapted Mesopotamian patterns. It echoes in political theology that conceptualizes authority as something seized and defended rather than something inherent and permanent. It echoes in the modern recognition that institutions are fragile, that order requires maintenance, that power is contested, and that history is written by victors who claim legitimacy retrospectively. The texts themselves seem aware of this. The error epic ends with a blessing on those who recite it, acknowledging error's power and appeasing his potential for future violence. The Enuma Elish was recited annually at the new year to renew Marduk's authority, as if that authority required ritual reaffirmation to remain effective. The flood narratives were copied for millennia, preserving the memory that the gods once attempted total destruction and were stopped only by one god's disobedience. These texts function apotropaically by remembering the conflicts, by naming the powers, by acknowledging the violence. Communities attempted to prevent recurrence, or at least to understand why recurrence was inevitable. The question we are left with is not whether the Anunnaki existed as literal beings. The question is what these texts preserve, and why Mesopotamian civilization preserved them so carefully. If they are pure fiction, they are fiction obsessed with procedural detail, institutional dysfunction, and tactical realism. If they are symbolic, they are symbols that consistently depict authority as violent, unstable, and contested. If they are historical memory, they are memory of a ruling hierarchy whose internal wars were so catastrophic that they shaped political consciousness for 3,000 years. What is undeniable is that the texts exist. They were written, copied, studied, recited, and preserved across millennia by cultures that took them seriously enough to teach them to every generation. Whether those cultures believed the gods were literal beings or understood them as theological concepts, they embedded the patterns those texts described into their political structures, their legal codes, their kingship ideologies, their temple hierarchies. The war the texts describe between factions within a ruling elite over control of ultimate authority, waged through theft, sabotage, deployment of catastrophic weapons, and generational coups, that war became the template for how Mesopotamian civilization understood power. And perhaps the most unsettling detail is how familiar the pattern remains. Substitute Tablet of Destinies with nuclear codes, and Anzi's theft becomes a nightmare scenario modern militaries prepare against. Substitute flood with weapons of mass destruction, and Enlil's strategy becomes a debate that still occurs in defense ministries. Substitute divine assembly with international councils, and the factional disputes between Enlil and Enki become recognizable as great power politics. The names change, the technology updates, but the underlying logic, that authority requires both force and legitimacy, that it can be seized through opportunistic action, that restraint requires active enforcement, that catastrophic weapons exist and might be deployed if factional disputes escalate beyond negotiation, that logic remains operative. The Anunnaki's war was not simply lost, it was never won. It continues in different forms, under different names, with different actors. What the Sumerian texts preserve is not just ancient history, they preserve the logic of authority itself, stripped of comforting illusions about natural order or divine harmony, presented with procedural honesty as a system maintained through force, contested through conflict, and transferred through violence when negotiation fails. The fragment in Philadelphia weighs less than a kilogram. It will outlast all of us. Millennia from now, if anyone still reads cuneiform, they will see the same marks we see today, telling the same story. When kingship descended from heaven, the gods went to war. Humanity was created. The flood came, and the survivor, Ziusudra, was granted eternal life and sent away to Dilmun, where he would not interfere with what came next. What came next was 4,000 years of civilization shaped by those events, whether they were literal or symbolic. And what comes next for us is shaped by the same patterns, whether we acknowledge them or not. The war that still echoes is the war over who holds authority, how they maintain it, and what happens when the system designed to contain conflict fails. The Anunnaki fought that war and lost, not because they were defeated, but because the war itself cannot be won. It can only be managed, postponed, contained through vigilance and wisdom and restraint. And when those fail, as the text insists they eventually do, the cycle begins again. We have examined the evidence. We have presented both interpretations, mainstream and alternative, the choice of which to accept is yours. But the texts remain, patient and permanent, inscribed in clay, preserved in vaults, waiting for each generation to discover them again and decide what they mean. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, kings, or something else entirely, they left a record, and that record describes a war that has never ended, fought over weapons we still recognise, driven by conflicts we still experience, producing outcomes we still witness. The tablets have been patient for 4,000 years. They will be patient for 4,000 more. And the war they describe will continue, echoing through whatever civilizations rise and fall, until someone finally learns the lesson the Anunnaki never did, that authority secured through violence alone is authority that will be lost through violence, and that the only war worth winning is war to build systems that do not require war to function. Whether such a system is possible remains an open question. The Mesopotamian text suggests the answer is no, but perhaps that is why they preserve the record so carefully, not to celebrate the inevitability of conflict, but to warn future generations what happens when conflict becomes the only language power speaks. The fragment sits in its vault, the story it preserves sits in these texts, and the war it describes sits in the logic we have inherited, still operative, still shaping how we think about authority, order, and the costs of maintaining both. What we do with that inheritance is the question each generation must answer. The Sumerians answered by recording everything, preserving the memory even when they could not resolve the conflict. Perhaps that is wisdom enough, to remember, to transmit, to ensure the pattern is not forgotten even when it cannot be broken. The war the Anunnaki lost was the war against forgetting. They lost battles, they lost kingship, they lost control, but they did not lose the record. It survives, inscribed in clay, waiting in darkness, speaking to anyone willing to listen about wars fought in heaven, floods unleashed on earth, and the fragile, violent, contested thing we call order. If you made it this far, you have heard the evidence. You have followed the trajectory from fragment to pattern to echo. You understand what the texts say, what scholars say, and what remains unexplained. The decision of what it means rests with you, but whatever conclusion you reach, the tablets remain. Patient witnesses to conflicts whose resolution was never achieved, whose logic was never transcended, whose echoes still shape how we understand power, authority, and the price of maintaining order when the gods themselves cannot agree. The war continues. The record endures, and somewhere in a vault in Philadelphia, a fragment of clay preserves the beginning. When kingship descended from heaven, the Anunnaki went to war. Humanity survived. And the question of what that means has never been answered. Perhaps it never